Tonight, I have 11 true stories about the moments when the world stops making sense, and the aftermath looks more like a dark art gallery than a crime scene. We will hear about victims hidden in plain sight, encased in ice, or left in the desert as if they were waiting for a bus that will never come. If you are listening alone tonight, make sure your doors are locked and the volume is just right for the silence. If you enjoy these strange and mysterious accounts, please subscribe and leave a comment to let me know where in the world you are tuning in from tonight. As for the like button, treat it like a sheet of reinforced glass over a deep, dark pit. You might be hesitant to put your full weight on it, but go ahead and give it a firm tap just to see what kind of sound it makes. All right, check the locks. Settle into your chair and listen to the rain against the glass. We are starting in a place of healing and steam, where the water hides more than just the minerals from view. Let the white noise fade into the background as we head to the volcanic coast of Iceland, where the earth breathes through the cracks in the black stone. In the early morning of 1995, the wind over the Reykjanes Peninsula was sharp enough to cut through the heaviest wool. A maintenance diver named John stood on the edge of the blue lagoon, watching the steam rise in thick, white curtains from the surface of the water. He adjusted his mask, feeling the familiar weight of his gear, and prepared to sink into the milky warmth that defines the volcanic landscape. Long before John found what was waiting for him at the bottom, a man in his late 50s moved through the international terminals of Europe with the practiced ease of a ghost. He wore a tuxedo that had been hand-stitched by a master, the kind of wool that feels like cool water against the skin. He did not carry a heavy suitcase, only a small leather briefcase that looked as though it had never touched a dirty floor. This man frequented the quiet corners of grand hotels across the continent, sitting in velvet chairs where the lighting was always dim and the service was impeccably discreet. He would order a single glass of expensive, single malt scotch, never looking at the menu, and watch the other guests with a calm, detached curiosity. His movements were precise and never rushed, reflecting a life built on rigid schedules and clinical habits. He was the type of person who paid for everything in high-denomination notes, leaving tips that were generous enough to ensure he was never bothered with questions. He walked through the rain under a black umbrella, his shoes clicking rhythmically against the cobblestones as if he were marking time. There was a loneliness to his precision, the kind that belongs to someone who has spent decades being exactly who he needs to be. In the quiet of his hotel room, he would lay out his clothes for the following day with a ritualistic care that bordered on the religious. He smoothed the lapels of his jacket and polished his cufflinks until they caught the moonlight through the high window. He was a man who understood that in his world, a single loose thread was a crack in the armor, and he refused to let anyone see the person underneath his expensive uniform. He had a habit of standing by the window for hours, looking out at the dark Atlantic waves as they crashed against the black basalt cliffs. He did not speak to anyone on the phone, and no letters ever arrived for him at the front desk of the luxury establishment. He was a human island, drifting through a sea of luxury, seemingly content to remain a total mystery to everyone he encountered in his travels across the world. Sometimes he would take a long walk toward the harbor, his hands deep in his pockets, watching the fishing boats come in with their silver hauls. He looked like a man who was waiting for a specific signal, or perhaps a man who had already received one and was simply counting down the minutes. His face was a mask of stoic calm, betraying nothing of the intricate plans he had made or the things he had seen during his journey. He spent a significant amount of time in the hotel libraries, surrounded by the smell of old leather and the quiet scratching of pens. He read history books and ancient maps, tracing his finger over the rugged coastlines as if he were looking for a lost treasure. He never took notes, and he never left a bookmark behind, possessing a memory that seemed to capture every detail with photographic clarity in the dim light. There were moments when he would sit in the hotel lobby and watch families arrive, his eyes lingering on the children as they ran toward the elevators. A faint, unreadable expression would cross his face, a momentary softening of the mask that suggested a life of missed opportunities. He was a man who had traded the warmth of human connection for the cold, hard certainty of success, and the safety of the dark shadows. On his final night, he stood before the mirror and adjusted his bow tie one last time. Ensuring the knot was perfectly symmetrical and sharp, he looked at his reflection with a cold, analytical gaze, as if he were inspecting a stranger he had just met in a hallway. He turned off the lights, stepped out into the dark hallway, and disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of expensive tobacco. A few miles away at the Blue Lagoon, the night shift had just ended, and the area was supposed to be completely deserted and still. The security cameras showed only the swirling steam and the occasional ripple on the surface of the mineral-rich water. It was a place of healing and beauty, a destination for the world's elite to soak away the stresses of their high-pressure and often secretive lives. When John, the maintenance diver, reached the intake pipe on that cold morning, the water felt like a warm, heavy blanket pressing against his suit. He swung his flashlight in a slow arc, the beam struggling to penetrate the thick clouds of silica suspended in the pool. Then, the light hit something black and solid, a stark contrast to the pale, milky blue world he was exploring beneath the surface of the water. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing against a fabric that felt entirely out of place in a geothermal spa. He pulled back a cloud of silt, and the beam revealed the pale, unblinking face of a man staring up at him from the bottom. The man was wedged firmly against the metal grate of the intake pipe, his arms floating slightly in the current like a slow-motion greeting to the silent world above. The police arrival was a clinical affair, with yellow tape stretched across the black lava rocks while the body was winched from the water. The investigators stood in the steam, their breath hitching as the victim emerged. Still perfectly dressed in his high-end tuxedo, his skin was unnaturally white, preserved by the silica and the heat, giving him the appearance of a marble statue found in an ancient ruin. The first observation the lead detective made was the sheer absurdity of the scene. A man dressed for a gala at the bottom of a volcano. They searched the pockets of the jacket, but they found no wallet, no chaos, and no identification of any kind. Even more troubling was the realization that every single label had been carefully removed from his clothing, leaving only raw, frayed threads behind in their place. They turned the body over and found a professional diving rig strapped to his back. The straps tightened with expert precision. It was high-end equipment, the kind used by deep-sea explorers. Yet it looked brand new, as if it had never been used before this night. The investigators could not understand why a man in a formal tuxedo would need a scuba tank to enter a shallow geothermal pool in the dark. A team was dispatched to the local welding shops in Reykjavik, showing photos of the tank and the unique valves attached to it. After several days of searching, they found a shop owner who recognized the equipment immediately. He told the officers that a tank just like it had been stolen from his workshop 3 days prior, but it had not been filled with normal, breathable air like a regular tank. The detective felt a cold knot form in his stomach as the shop owner explained that the tank had been filled with pure, industrial nitrogen. He had been preparing it for a specialized welding project when it vanished from his secure storage area. The realization hit the room like a physical weight. The man in the lagoon had not been diving. He had been breathing a lethal, invisible gas until the end. Forensic experts began a deep dive into the victim's fingerprints, sending them to every major law enforcement agency in the world. They checked Interpol, the FBI, and the security databases of dozens of nations. But the results were always the same. The man in the tuxedo did not exist in any system, as if he had been born and raised in the deep shadows of the global elite without leaving a trail. The police contacted every high-end tailor in London and Paris, hoping that someone would recognize the unique stitching pattern in the tuxedo's lining. They sent samples of the wool and the thread to textile experts who confirmed that the suit was a bespoke creation from a house that catered to heads of state. Yet, when the master tailors were questioned, they claimed to have no record of a client with that description. The investigators even turned to the dental records of missing persons from across Europe, hoping that the man's expensive bridge work would provide a clue. The porcelain was of the highest quality, a type of cosmetic dentistry that was only available to the wealthiest 1% of the population. However, the unique signature of the dental lab was a dead end. As the records had been destroyed years prior, the lab results from the autopsy confirmed the shop owner's fears, showing that the victim's lungs were filled with pure nitrogen gas. There were no signs of a struggle, no bruises on his neck, and no defensive wounds on his hands. He had simply sat down in the warm water, put the regulator in his mouth, and allowed the gas to replace his oxygen until his heart finally stopped in the silence. The realization began to dawn on the investigators that this was not a random murder, but a highly ritualized return to a home that no longer existed. The man had spent his entire life building a wall of wealth and anonymity, only to come back to the very earth that birthed him. He had chosen the Blue Lagoon because it was the physical heart of the island, a place where the steam would hide his breath. I sometimes wonder if he felt the heat of the water as he descended, or if the nitrogen took hold of his mind before he reached the bottom. He had transformed his own death into a silent, underwater performance, one that ensured he would be found exactly as he wanted to be remembered. He was a man who had controlled every second of his life, and his end was no different from his most precise habits. Through 2026, the case remains officially unsolved, and the victim remains unidentified in the Reykjavik police files. Advanced DNA testing has been conducted on the remains, but they have yet to find a match in any genealogical database across the world. He is still known only as the Tuxedo Diver, a permanent resident of the archives who continues to watch from the silence of the mystery. The silence of the Blue Lagoon is a specific kind of quiet, the kind that feels like it is waiting for a secret to finally be told. It is the same silence you might find in a high-security vault in the center of Zurich, where the only thing louder than the money is the sound of a dead man's confession. In the late autumn of 1995, a thin gray mist hung over the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich, clinging to the heavy stone facades of the world's most powerful banks. Hans, a senior vice president with 30 years of spotless service, stepped out of his black sedan and adjusted the lapels of his charcoal wool coat. He checked his watch, a heavy platinum piece that never lost a single second, and began his morning walk toward the high-security entrance of the vault. Hans lived a life of absolute, mathematical precision that most people would find suffocating, but he found it deeply comforting. Every morning at precisely 7:15, he sat at the same mahogany desk to review the overnight transactions from the New York and Tokyo markets. He enjoyed the silent, climate-controlled air of his private office, which felt like a sanctuary of logic in an increasingly chaotic world. His colleagues respected him not for his personality, but for his uncanny ability to see patterns in global wealth where others saw only noise. He was a man who preferred the company of spreadsheets and ancient ledgers over the loud buck. Messy reality of the streets outside. To Hans, the bank was not just a place of work. It was a fortress of order that he had helped build through decades of discipline. If you were to stand beside him in that silent office, you would feel the weight of centuries of Swiss tradition pressing down on your shoulders. It is a world where a whisper carries more weight than a shout, and where secrets are the most valuable currency anyone can ever possess. You begin to understand why a man like Hans would feel completely untouchable inside these reinforced steel and glass walls. The bank operated on a set of rules that had remained unchanged since the 19th century, favoring stability over the rapid fluctuations of modern technology. Hans took pride in the fact that his institution was a lighthouse for the wealthy, providing a safe harbor during the frequent storms of global politics. He viewed himself as a guardian of this stability, a role he performed with a cold and relentless intensity every single day. He personally oversaw the installation of the new biometric scanners, testing them himself to ensure they could not be fooled by anything less than a living human eye. For Hans, the security of the bank was a direct reflection of his own personal integrity and his standing in the high society of Zurich. He believed that if the vault was secure, Then the moral center of the city was also safe from any outside interference. He spent his weekends at a quiet estate overlooking Lake Zurich, where he tended to a small garden of rare alpine flowers with the same clinical attention. Even there, the rows were perfectly straight and the soil was meticulously maintained to provide the exact nutrients each plant required to thrive. He brought the same rigid structure to his personal life that he applied to the complex financial structures of his high-net-worth clients. Despite his immense wealth, Hans was not a man of excess, preferring a simple meal of trout and a single glass of white wine in the evenings. He rarely traveled for pleasure, as he found the unpredictability of international travel to be a nuisance that disrupted his carefully balanced internal clock. He had built a perfect, glass-walled cage for himself, and he was entirely happy to live within its narrow, polished confines. He often mentored the younger executives, teaching them that a successful banker is one who is never surprised and who always anticipates the worst-case scenario. He watched them closely, looking for any sign of weakness or greed that might compromise the bank's reputation for absolute and unwavering reliability. In his eyes, the bank was a permanent fixture of civilization, and it was his duty to ensure it remained unchanged by time. On the evening of November 12th, Hans felt a rare sense of accomplishment as he closed a deal that had been several months in the making. He leaned back in his leather chair, listening to the soft, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system and the distant chime of a clock in the hallway. The office was a fortress of his own making, a place where the outside world could never reach him without permission. He reached into his drawer for a fountain pen to sign the final document, his hand moving with a steady and practiced grace across the paper. He noticed a small, faint smudge on the edge of the document, a detail so minor that most people would have ignored it entirely. This is not how it is supposed to look, he thought, feeling a sudden and sharp prick of annoyance at the imperfection. He looked for a clean sheet, but his hand stopped mid-air as he heard a sound that was so out of place in the silent office that he froze. It was a soft, dry crinkle, like the sound of dead leaves being crushed under a heavy boot on a cold and lonely autumn morning. He looked around the room, but he saw nothing out of order, and the heavy steel door remained bolted from the inside. The sound seemed to come from the center of his desk, but there was nothing there except his lamp and the leather-bound blotter he had used for years. He felt a sudden, sharp sting on the tip of his right index finger, as if he had been pricked by a tiny, invisible needle. He looked at his hand, but there was no blood, only a faint red mark that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He tried to stand up, but his legs felt heavy and unresponsive, as if they had been turned into lead by some unseen force in the room. His vision began to blur at the edges, and the golden light from the desk lamp seemed to expand until it filled his entire field of view. He reached out to grab the edge of the desk, but his fingers refused to curl around the solid mahogany wood. In the final seconds of his life, Hans realized that the order he had built his entire world around was a fragile and temporary illusion. The silence of the office, once so comforting, now felt like a predatory weight that was pressing the very air out of his lungs. He slumped forward, his head resting on the documents he had just signed, while a single sheet of paper fluttered to the floor. The following morning, the cleaning crew found the lights still burning in the executive suite, which was a clear violation of the bank's strict energy protocols. When the manager unlocked the door with his master key, he found Hans exactly where he had fallen, his face a pale shade of gray. There was no sign of a struggle, and not a single item in the high-security office had been moved or even touched. Inspector Steiner arrived within 20 minutes, his boots clicking on the marble floors as he led a team of forensic specialists into the inner sanctuary. He had spent his career investigating the quiet and sophisticated crimes of the wealthy, but he had never seen a scene that felt so clinical. He moved slowly around the desk, his eyes searching for the one thing that would explain how a man could die in a vault. Steiner leaned in close, catching the sharp, clinical smell of expensive floor wax and old money that permeated the executive suite like a physical presence. The only sound in the room was the faint, rhythmic crinkle of hundred-year-old paper clutched in the dead man's stiffened right hand. It was a scroll of heavy parchment, yellowed with age and covered in a dense, calligraphic script that looked like a museum piece. The lab results revealed that Hans had been killed by a concentrated dose of a synthetic neurotoxin called batrachotoxin, which causes immediate and total heart failure. It was a substance so rare and so lethal that it was almost impossible to find outside of a high-level research facility or a government lab. The toxin had entered his system through a microscopic puncture on his finger, delivered by a mechanism that Steiner could not identify. The scroll in his hand was even more baffling to the investigators, as it detailed a series of illegal financial transactions from over 30 years prior. The handwriting was precise and elegant, accusing Hans of a moral sin that had long since been buried under layers of corporate secrecy and Swiss law. It was a confession that he had never signed, written on paper that had been stolen from the state archive years earlier. Steiner reviewed the security footage from the night of the murder, watching the high-definition feeds from 30 different angles around the executive suite and the hallways. The cameras showed Hans entering his office and locking the door, but they never showed anyone else approaching the room or even entering the building floor. The vault was a closed loop, a steel box that was supposed to be the most secure place in Zurich. Yet a ghost had entered. 6 months later, a second banker was found in nearly identical circumstances, slumped over a private terminal in a vault that required 3 separate biometric keys. He was also clutching a piece of the ancient parchment, this one detailing a different financial crime from a completely different decade of his long career. Zurich was gripped by a quiet, professional terror as the leaders of the financial world realized their walls were no longer thick enough. The second victim was a man who had prided himself on his philanthropy. Yet the scroll in his hand told a story of exploited labor and hidden accounts. The precision of the information suggested that the killer had access to files that had been shredded and deleted before the turn of the century. It was as if the history of the bank itself had grown a pair of hands and decided to settle its own debts. Steiner's investigation eventually led him to a brilliant former archivist who had been fired from the state library for his obsessive and erratic behavior toward the elite. He was a man who knew the hidden history of every prominent family in Zurich and who had spent his life surrounded by ancient and rare documents. He seemed like the perfect suspect, a man with the motive, the knowledge, and the materials to carry out this crusade. However, when Steiner tracked the man down, he found him in the long-term care wing of a private hospital on the quiet outskirts of the city. The archivist had been in a deep, irreversible coma for over a year, following a massive stroke that had left him completely paralyzed and unresponsive. He was hooked up to a dozen machines, his eyes closed, providing him with a perfect and undeniable alibi for every single murder. The third murder occurred just as Steiner was beginning to believe he was chasing a literal ghost through the digital and physical corridors of the bank. This time, the victim was a young, rising star in the investment world, found dead in a high-speed elevator that was programmed to never stop. He held a scroll that was still wet with ink, as if the killer had been standing right beside him just seconds before. The investigators eventually discovered that the killer was not a ghost or a vengeful archivist, but a highly sophisticated security consultant who had designed the bank's systems. He had built invisible backdoors into the biometric software and the ventilation controls, allowing him to move through the buildings like a shadow in the computer code. He used the archivist's old research as his guide, turning the elite's own security into a weapon against them. The consultant had spent years working for the very men he eventually killed, learning their schedules, their habits, and the dark secrets they kept hidden in their vaults. He didn't want their money, which he could have stolen at any time, but rather he wanted to expose the moral rot he saw. He viewed himself as a cleaner, someone who was removing the stains from the fabric of the city using the most clinical methods. He vanished before the police could execute a search warrant, leaving behind a completely empty apartment and a hard drive that had been wiped with military-grade software. He had played the long game, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the men he believed were the true criminals of the Swiss financial district. He left no fingerprints, no DNA, and no clues that would allow the authorities to track his movements. The search for the paper trail killer continued for several years, but the trail eventually went cold as the banks refused to cooperate with any public inquiry. They were more afraid of the damage to their reputation for absolute privacy than they were of the person who had managed to infiltrate their most secure rooms. The consultant became a whispered legend, a man who had proven that the most dangerous enemy is the one you hire. In 2005, the Swiss government officially sealed the files on the murders under a series of banking privacy laws that protect the interests of the elite. Through 2026, the case remains a cold verdict, and the identity of the consultant has never been confirmed by any law enforcement agency in the world. The Golden Mile returned to its silent rhythm, but the executives still look at their mail with a certain lingering fear. The clinical silence of the Zurich vaults is a world away from the humid and chaotic energy of a tropical city during a summer storm. It is a place where a man can disappear in a locked room, much like four men who once stepped into a steel elevator and simply ceased to exist. On the humid afternoon of June 15th, 1995, in the heart of Port Moresby, a man named David Keela adjusted his spectacles while standing near the window of a fifth-floor government office. The tropical sun was heavy over the capital of Papua New Guinea, turning the concrete of the newly built tower into a radiator that hummed with stored heat. David was a senior member of the Central Province Council, a man who moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had spent decades navigating the complexities of local politics. He tucked a thick leather briefcase under his arm, preparing for the short journey from his office to the ground floor lobby where his driver was waiting. David was a man of quiet habits and deep connections to the land just outside the city limits. He spent his weekends in a small village where he was known more for his skill with a fishing line than his influence in the halls of government. He was currently planning the wedding of his eldest daughter, a task that required the same level of diplomacy and detail as a national trade agreement. Every morning before the heat became unbearable, he would sit on his veranda and drink a single cup of bitter black coffee while watching the birds move through the canopy. His colleague, Samuel, was already standing by the office door, checking his reflection in the glass partition. Samuel was 10 years younger than David, possessed of a sharp, ambitious energy and a laugh that could be heard across the entire floor. He had 3 young sons who were the center of his world, and he often spent his lunch breaks at the local market buying small toys or sweets to bring home to them. Samuel was the type of man who remembered everyone's birthday and never missed a chance to ask about a coworker's family or their health. Elias joined them a moment later, wiping sweat from his brow with a neatly folded handkerchief. He was the quietest of the group, a man who had earned a law degree late in life and viewed every government policy through a lens of strict, unyielding logic. Elias lived alone in a small apartment filled with books on constitutional law and history, finding his peace in the silent study of the past. He was the anchor of the council, the one who could always find the flaw in a proposed plan before it had a chance to fail. The fourth man, Thomas, was the youngest of the group and had only recently been appointed to the council after a successful career in rural development. He was still adjusting to the pace of the capital, often looking out the windows at the distant blue mountains with a look of profound longing. Thomas had a new baby at home, a daughter who had just learned to recognize his voice, and he was eager to finish the day's business. He often felt the weight of his child in his arms as he walked through the heavy steel doors of the office building. These 4 men represented the future of the Central Province, a group of dedicated professionals who were working to bring schools and clean water to the remote villages of the interior. They had spent the afternoon discussing infrastructure projects, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic, productive cadence that suggested a deep mutual respect. There was no tension between them, only the shared fatigue of a long day's work and the anticipation of returning to their respective homes. The office was filled with the smell of old paper and the constant, low-level drone of the air conditioning. As 5 o'clock approached, the office began to quiet down as the junior staff packed their bags and headed for the stairwells. David looked at his 3 colleagues and gestured toward the hallway, his briefcase clutched firmly in his right hand. They walked together, their shoes clicking on the polished linoleum floors in a synchronized beat that echoed through the nearly empty corridor. The building was a symbol of modern progress, a concrete and steel structure that was supposed to represent the stability of the new administration. They reached the elevator bank at the end of the hall, a pair of gleaming silver doors that looked out of place against the aging walls of the district. David pressed the call button, and a small chime rang out, a clean, mechanical sound that seemed to signal the official end of their workday. They stood in silence for a moment, the heat of the afternoon pressing in through the glass windows at the end of the hall. The elevator arrived with a soft hiss, the doors sliding open to reveal a brightly lit, wood-paneled interior that smelled faintly of lemon wax. The 4 men stepped inside the cabin, their combined weight causing the floor to settle with a subtle, reassuring vibration. Thomas stood near the control panel and pressed the button for the lobby, the plastic square illuminating with a steady, amber light. As the doors began to slide shut, Samuel made a brief joke about the traffic on the road to the harbor, causing the others to smile. The cabin was a small, private world, isolated from the noise and heat of the city by layers of reinforced steel and high-speed cables. You can feel the faint, downward tug in your knees as the motor in the ceiling begins to whine, a sound that vibrates through your teeth. The light from the overhead fluorescent panel is steady and cold, reflecting off the polished brass handrails and the dark wood of the walls. There is no sensation of speed, only the rhythmic passing of the floor levels as the indicator above the door blinks from 5 to 4. The space is cramped but functional, a steel box designed to move human lives from one point to another without fail or interruption. Halfway between the 3rd and 2nd floors, the overhead light flickered once, casting the men into a momentary, terrifying darkness. The elevator didn't stop or jerk, but for a single heartbeat, the hum of the motor seemed to change its pitch, becoming a low, vibrating growl. David shifted his briefcase to his other hand, his brow furrowing as he looked at the floor indicator which had stopped blinking entirely. A strange, sharp smell began to fill the small space, something like the metallic scent of a coming storm or an electrical short. In the lobby, a security guard named Peter sat behind a heavy oak desk, his eyes fixed on the arrival lights of the elevator bank. He was a man who had worked in the building since it opened, and he knew the timing of every lift by the sound of the cables. He watched as the needle for the main elevator descended steadily, moving from the 3rd floor toward the ground with its usual mechanical precision. There were no alarms, no sounds of distress, and no indication that anything unusual was happening inside the shaft. The elevator reached the lobby and came to a smooth, perfect stop, the chime ringing out to announce its arrival to the empty hall. Peter stood up, ready to greet the council members as he did every evening before they departed for their cars. The doors slid open with their usual hiss, revealing the brightly lit interior of the cabin to the quiet lobby. Peter took a step forward, a polite greeting forming on his lips, but he stopped dead as his eyes processed the scene inside the steel box. The elevator was completely vacant, the wood-paneled walls reflecting only the empty light of the lobby. On the center of the floor sat David's leather briefcase, its brass latches gleaming under the overhead lights, but there was no sign of the 4 men. Peter looked at the briefcase and then up at the ceiling hatch, which was securely bolted from the outside and showed no signs of tampering. He walked into the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs, and looked at the control panel where the lobby button was still glowing amber. I have looked at the blueprints of that lift shaft, and there is no physical way for a human body to leave that space while in motion. The walls of the shaft are solid concrete, with no maintenance doors or gaps larger than a few inches between the car and the landing. It is a closed system, a vertical tunnel designed to ensure that whatever goes in at the top must come out at the bottom. Yet, 4 grown men had stepped into a moving box and vanished before they reached the ground floor of a high-security building. The building was immediately placed under a total lockdown, with police and security teams sealing every exit and searching every room from the roof to the basement. They brought in structural engineers to examine the elevator car, looking for hidden compartments or false panels that could have hidden 4 adults. Every vent was inspected, and the elevator pit was drained and searched for any sign of remains or clothing. The search lasted for 48 hours, but not a single hair, fingerprint, or drop of blood was found anywhere in the shaft. Australian Federal Police were brought in to consult on the case. Using thermal imaging cameras to look through the concrete walls for hidden voids, they analyzed the building's electrical grid, looking for evidence of a power surge or a mechanical failure that could explain the strange ozone smell. The investigators found that a brief power flicker had occurred across the entire district at the exact moment the elevator was between floors. However, the elevator's backup battery had kicked in instantly, and the car had never lost momentum or diverted from its path. The most disturbing evidence came from the elevator's internal weight sensor, which was linked to the building's central security computer. The logs showed that when the car left the 5th floor, it was carrying a load of approximately 800 pounds. Halfway through the descent, the sensor recorded a sudden and total drop to 0 pounds, as if the passengers had simply ceased to exert pressure on the floor. This weight change happened in less than a second, and the car did not bounce or shake as it would have if 4 men had jumped. Forensic teams spent weeks analyzing the briefcase that David had left behind on the floor of the cabin. It contained nothing but ordinary government documents, a pair of reading glasses, and a small photograph of his daughter in her wedding dress. There were no signs of a struggle on the leather, and no foreign DNA was found on the handle or the latches. It was as if David had simply set the bag down and walked through a door that no one else could see or touch. The families of the 4 men were left in a state of agonizing limbo, caught between the hope of a kidnapping and the reality of a vanishing. There were no ransom demands, no political manifestos, and no witnesses who saw anyone leaving the building with 4 high-profile prisoners. In the absence of information, the city of Port Moresby began to fill the void with rumors of sorcery and ancient spirits. Many believed the men had been taken by the land itself, a punishment for the rapid modernization of the capital. Police also investigated the possibility of a highly coordinated extraction by a rival political faction using a bypass key and a hidden exit. They interviewed every maintenance worker and technician who had ever worked on the building's infrastructure. No one could explain how such a feat could be accomplished without being caught on the dozens of security cameras that monitored the lobby and the hallways. Every second of the footage from that afternoon was reviewed, and it showed the men entering the lift, but it never showed them coming out. The building itself seemed to change after the disappearance, with workers reporting a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that made it difficult to stay after dark. Many employees resigned, citing the sound of phantom footsteps in the hallways and the smell of ozone that would suddenly fill the elevator bank. The tower, once a symbol of a bright and prosperous future, became a concrete monument to a mystery that no one wanted to solve. The government eventually moved its offices to a different location, leaving the tower to the dust and the shadows. The investigation was officially suspended in 1998 after all leads had been exhausted and no new evidence had surfaced. The case was classified as a missing persons matter, but in the minds of the public, it was something far more dark and inexplicable. The elevator car was decommissioned and welded shut, a steel tomb for a moment in time that defied every law of physics and logic. The briefcase was returned to David's widow, who kept it in a glass case as a final, silent connection to her husband. There is a specific kind of horror in a disappearance that leaves behind a physical object, a mundane item that should be accompanied by a human hand. The briefcase was a reminder that the world had not ended for David, but rather that he had been subtracted from it without a sound. It sat in that empty elevator car like a period at the end of a sentence that no one was allowed to finish reading. The absolute silence of the scene was louder than any scream or struggle could ever have been. Through 2026, the building stands as a derelict landmark in Port Moresby, its windows broken and its concrete walls covered in vines. It is known locally as the Ghost Elevator of Moresby, a place that even the most daring urban explorers avoid when the sun begins to set. The case file remains in the archives of the Australian Federal Police, a cold case mystery that serves as a warning about the limits of human understanding. The four men were never found, and no evidence has ever been recovered from the jungles or the sea. The tower remains a dark silhouette against the tropical sky, a place where four lives were paused in mid-descent and never resumed. The mystery of the elevator is a reminder that even in our modern, monitored world, there are gaps in reality that we cannot explain. It is a story of a routine act that turned into a permanent departure, leaving only an empty steel box and a briefcase behind. The rain continues to fall on the concrete, washing away the traces of those who walked those halls. But the silence inside the shaft remains absolute. The cold, industrial mystery of a vanishing in a steel box is a sharp contrast to the ancient, quiet traditions of a mountain temple. It is a leap from the hum of modern machinery to the smell of incense and the sight of a set of robes left behind on a cold stone floor. In 1995, the city of Luang Prabang was a place of orange silk and drifting wood smoke, where the Mekong River moved like slow honey against the banks. Somchai P. sat on a thin woven mat in the center of the great hall, his back a straight line against the pre-dawn chill. He was 19 years old, a novice monk who had found his rhythm in the quiet chants and the rhythmic sweeping of the temple courtyard. He adjusted his posture slightly, feeling the rough texture of the mat against his ankles as the smell of stale incense hung in the stagnant air. Somchai had grown up in a small village 3 days' journey downriver, a place where the jungle pressed right up against the wooden stilts of his family's home. He was a quiet boy who preferred the company of his own thoughts, often spending hours by the water, watching the dragonflies hover over the reeds. His mother remembered him as the child who never complained, the one who would give his portion of rice to a stray dog without a second thought. He had entered the monastery not out of a lack of options, but because he found a profound peace in the structure of the rituals. He was particularly fond of the early mornings. Before the sun had even touched the gilded spires of the temple roofs, he would be the first one awake, moving through the sleeping quarters like a ghost to light the small oil lamps in the hall. He enjoyed the way the light caught the dust motes in the air, turning the mundane task into something that felt sacred and ancient. His movements were always deliberate and practiced, a physical manifestation of the internal stillness he worked so hard to maintain during his long hours of study. In the weeks leading up to the retreat, Somchai had been working on a small carving of a lotus flower made from a scrap of fragrant cedar wood. He intended it as a gift for his younger sister, who was set to be married at the end of the rainy season. He would work on it during his brief periods of rest, his fingers moving with a surprising agility as he peeled away the layers of wood. He often thought about the life she would lead, hoping that the quiet strength he had found in the temple would somehow reach her through the small object. His teachers noted that Somchai possessed a rare degree of focus for a young man his age, often sitting for hours without shifting his weight once. He didn't seem to struggle with the physical demands of the ascetic life, treating every ache and pain as just another sensation to be observed and released. There was a kindness in his eyes that drew people to him, though he rarely spoke more than a few words at a time. He was the type of person who made the world feel smaller and more manageable just by being present in the room. He often spent his evenings reading the old manuscripts in the temple library, tracing the fading ink with a reverence that bordered on the obsessive. He was fascinated by the stories of the ancient masters who had achieved enlightenment in the very mountains that surrounded the city. To Somchai, these were not just myths, but roadmaps for a journey he was determined to complete himself. He felt a deep responsibility to uphold the traditions of his order, viewing every chant and every bow as a vital link in an unbroken chain of history. His relationship with the senior monks was one of quiet respect, as he rarely needed correction or guidance in his daily duties. They saw in him a potential successor, someone who would eventually take on the weight of leadership and maintain the sanctity of the temple for the next generation. He never sought praise or recognition, finding enough satisfaction in the knowledge that his work contributed to the harmony of the community. His life was a series of small, graceful actions that built toward a future of profound and lasting service. One of his favorite duties was preparing the morning offerings of fruit and sticky rice for the villagers who lined the streets at dawn. He enjoyed the brief, silent interaction with the local people, seeing the gratitude in their faces as they placed food into his bowl. It was a reminder of the interconnectedness of all things, a concept that he meditated on frequently during his private hours. He felt a deep sense of belonging in Luang Prabang, a city that lived and breathed the same ancient rhythms that he did. Despite his devotion, he occasionally felt a sharp pang of homesickness when the wind carried the scent of rain-soaked earth from the jungle. He would close his eyes and see his mother's face, illuminated by the fire as she prepared the evening meal in their distant village. These moments of longing were brief. However, as he would quickly refocus his mind on the present task and the commitment he had made. He believed that his presence in the temple was a way of honoring his family, a spiritual sacrifice that would bring them merit in the lives to come. The upcoming Vasa retreat was a time he had been preparing for with a mix of anticipation and a focused, internal intensity. It was 3 months of absolute silence and meditation, a period where the monks would not leave the temple grounds for any reason. For Somchai, it was an opportunity to dive deeper into the silence he so loved, to see what lay beneath the surface of his own mind. He had prepared his mind like a warrior preparing for battle, sharpening his concentration until it felt as thin and precise as a needle. He made sure to finish the lotus carving the day before the retreat began, wrapping it in a piece of clean cloth and placing it in his small wooden trunk. He felt a sense of completion as he looked at the finished piece, the cedar wood glowing with a soft, natural luster. It was the last material tie he had to the world outside, and he was ready to let it go for the duration of the 3 months. He sat on his mat that final evening, watching the sun dip below the mountains, and felt a profound sense of readiness. The rules of the Vasa were strict and absolute, designed to eliminate any possible distraction from the pursuit of spiritual clarity. The doors to the Great Hall were bolted from the inside every evening after the final chant, and the windows were reinforced with heavy iron bars. 20 monks would sit in 4 perfect rows, their eyes closed and their breathing synchronized until the room felt like a single, living organism. No one was permitted to move or speak until the senior monk struck the bell at the first light of dawn. The air inside the hall was thick with the scent of beeswax and the cooling stone of the floor as the first night of the retreat began. Somchai took his place in the second row, his hands resting lightly in his lap as he closed his eyes and began to count his breaths. He could hear the soft rustle of robes as the other monks settled into their positions. And then a heavy, total silence descended over the room. It was a silence that felt solid, a physical weight that pressed against his skin and muffled the sounds of the jungle outside. In the deep quiet of the meditation, Somchai felt his awareness expand until the boundaries of his own body seemed to dissolve into the shadows of the hall. He wasn't thinking about the past or the future, but rather experiencing the raw, unfiltered reality of the present moment. The darkness of the room was not empty to him, but filled with a vibrant, humming energy that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. I am exactly where I am supposed to be, he thought, a final flash of ego before descending into the wordless depths of the trance. Hours passed in a seamless flow of time, with the only indicator of the passing night being the gradual cooling of the air against his face. The other 19 monks remained as still as statues, their presence a collective anchor that held the space in a state of suspended animation. Outside, The tropical rain began to fall in a steady, rhythmic pulse, drumming against the clay tiles of the roof with a hypnotic persistence. Inside the locked hall, there was no wind, no movement, and no light other than the faint, dying glow of a single candle at the altar. When the senior monk finally reached out and struck the bronze bell, the sound cut through the silence like a physical blade, echoing off the high wooden rafters. The monks slowly began to open their eyes and stretch their stiffened limbs, the collective trance breaking as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the iron bars. There was a low murmur of movement as men began to stand, their joints popping in the quiet room as they prepared for the morning chores. The senior monk looked across the rows, counting the heads of his students as he did every morning. His eyes stopped at the second row, where a gap had appeared in the perfect formation of saffron-clad bodies. He walked toward the spot where Somchai had been sitting, his heart quickening as he realized the mat was not occupied by a person. Instead, there was a pile of bright orange robes, folded with a precision that was almost unsettling, resting exactly where the young man's body should have been. The senior monk reached down and touched the fabric, finding it stone cold, as if it had been empty for many hours. The other monks gathered around the spot, their faces masks of confusion and growing dread as they looked at the vacant mat. The robes were not crumpled or tossed aside, but arranged in a neat, geometric pile that mimicked the seated posture of a meditating man. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no indication that anyone had moved through the crowded hall during the night. The heavy wooden doors were still bolted firmly from the inside, and the iron bars on the windows remained untouched and solid in their frames. The senior monk ordered a full search of the temple grounds, his voice tight with a concern that he struggled to keep from his face. They looked in the sleeping quarters, the library, and even the small storage sheds behind the kitchens, calling Somchai's name into the morning mist. They checked the thick jasmine vines that climbed the outer walls, looking for any sign of broken branches or disturbed leaves that would indicate a climb. Every corner of the sanctuary was turned over, but the 19-year-old novice had simply evaporated from the center of the locked room. Local police arrived within the hour, their heavy boots sounding loud and disrespectful on the sacred stone floors of the great hall. They examined the locks and the bars, searching for any secret passages or hidden panels that might have allowed a person to exit without detection. They interviewed every monk in the room, asking if anyone had heard a sound or seen a light during the long hours of the retreat. Each man gave the same answer. They had heard nothing but the rain, and they had seen nothing but the darkness. The investigation moved to the banks of the Mekong, where the authorities feared Somchai might have fallen into the fast-moving current and been swept away. They used long poles to probe the muddy depths near the temple's private pier, and they questioned the local fishermen who had been out since pre-dawn. No one had seen a young man in saffron robes, or a naked man for that matter, moving along the riverbank in the early hours of the morning. Somchai had no money, no shoes, and no reason to flee the only life he had ever truly loved. The police suspected that Somchai might have staged a transcendence as a way to defect to Thailand, perhaps seeking a life away from the rigors of the monastery. They checked the border crossings and the local bus stations, showing his photograph to anyone who might have seen a traveler matching his description. However, the theory made little sense to those who knew him, as Somchai possessed a devotion that was far deeper than any desire for worldly freedom. He had left behind his only prized possession, the cedarwood lotus sitting untouched in his trunk. A month into the disappearance, the rumors among the villagers began to take on a supernatural tone, with many claiming that Somchai had achieved a higher state of being. They believed he had meditated so intensely that he had simply slipped out of his physical form, leaving his robes behind as a final shed skin. The monks themselves were more skeptical, knowing that such a feat was the stuff of legends and not the reality of a 19-year-old novice. Yet, they could offer no other explanation for how a human being could vanish from a bolted room. The search was eventually scaled back as the rainy season intensified, turning the paths around the temple into rivers of thick, red mud. Then on, the police files remained open. But there were no new leads and no evidence to suggest that Somchai was either dead or alive somewhere else. His family came to the temple and sat on his mat, his mother weeping quietly as she touched the spot where his robes had been found. They left with the cedar lotus, the only physical piece of their son that remained in the world. If you stand in that hall today, you can see the faint outline on the stone where the mat once sat, a space that the other monks still refused to occupy. The precision of the robes is the detail that haunts the memory of everyone who was in the room that morning. They weren't just left. They were placed. It suggests an act of incredible calm and intent, performed in total darkness while 20 other men sat only inches away. The lack of a single footprint in the dust of the hall remains the most stubborn fact of the case. One theory that persisted among the investigators was that Somchai had been the victim of a highly professional kidnapping by individuals who knew the temple's internal schedule. They speculated that someone could have entered through a roof tile and lowered themselves down, though the height of the rafters made this nearly impossible without a ladder. Furthermore, such an act would have almost certainly alerted the other monks, who were trained to be hyper-aware of their surroundings. The theory eventually crumbled under its own lack of physical evidence, leaving the locked room mystery intact. Another possibility was that Somchai had suffered a sudden and total psychological break, causing him to flee into the jungle in a state of fugue. In this scenario, he would have removed his clothes in a moment of delirium and wandered into the dense undergrowth, where he would have quickly succumbed to the elements. However, this did not explain the meticulous folding of the robes, which required a high degree of motor control and a calm, steady hand. A man in the grip of a mental crisis does not stop to ensure his hem is perfectly aligned before vanishing. The senior monk eventually ordered a small shrine to be built at the exact spot where Somchai was last seen sitting in the lotus position. It is a simple wooden platform with a single candle and a bowl of fresh jasmine flowers, intended to honor a life that ended in a question mark. The monks continue their retreats in the hall, but the silence now feels different, as if it is a container that could open at any moment to swallow another of them. They sit with their eyes closed, but their ears are always straining for the sound of a robe rustling in the dark. Through 2026, the disappearance of Somchai P remains one of the most famous and baffling cold cases in the history of the Lao monastic order. There have been no sightings of him in Thailand or anywhere else in the region, and his name has never appeared on any official registry of citizens or monks. The temple keeps his name in the daily prayers, treating him as a brother who is perpetually between one world and the next. The mystery of the silent monk has become a part of the city's folklore, a story told to novices as a warning of the depths of the mind. The case file in Vientiane is thin, containing only a few photographs of the empty robes and the statements from the 19 witnesses who saw nothing. Every few years, a new investigator takes an interest in the locked room monk, but they always arrive at the same dead end of stone and iron. There is no DNA to test, no digital trail to follow, and no body to bury in the red earth of the peninsula. Somchai is a ghost of 19th century tradition trapped in a 21st century mystery that refuses to be solved. The incense continues to burn in the Great Hall of Luang Prabang, its smoke rising in the same slow spirals that Somchai once watched in the pre-dawn light. The Mekong still flows past the temple gates, carrying its secrets toward the sea, indifferent to the lives that are lost or found along its banks. The temple remains a place of peace, but it is a peace that is now shadowed by the knowledge that some doors can never be truly bolted against the unknown. The eerie, spiritual silence of a vanishing in a Lao temple is a world away from the howling winds of a mountain range in North Africa. It is a transition from the smell of jasmine and old wood to the blinding white of a blizzard where a woman in a wedding dress is walking toward the sky. In the late afternoon of January 19th, 1995, the shadows of the high Atlas Mountains stretched across the village of Imlil like long, dark fingers reaching for the valley floor. Elena, a 24-year-old French national with sun-bleached hair and a sturdy yellow backpack, sat on a low stone wall outside her guest house, tightening the laces of her hiking boots. She looked up toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks that sliced into the deep blue sky, her expression one of quiet, focused determination. Elena had grown up in the French Alps, where the mountains were not just scenery, but a way of defining the world around her. She worked as a freelance translator in Lyon, living a minimalist life that allowed her to save every possible franc for solo expeditions to the most remote ranges she could find on a map. Her small apartment was filled with topographical charts and carefully pressed wildflowers, reflecting a mind that found its greatest clarity in the thin, cold air of the heights. She was a woman of meticulous habits, known by her friends for the precise way she packed her gear and the unwavering schedule she kept during her treks. Every morning before dawn, she would record the temperature and wind direction in a leather-bound journal that never left her side. This trip to Morocco was supposed to be her masterpiece, a solo journey across the Toubkal Massif that she had been planning for nearly 3 years. Her parents remembered her as a child who would rather spend hours watching a hawk circle a ridge than play with the other children in the village square. She possessed a self-reliance that was both admirable and, at times, isolating, as she rarely sought the advice or company of other hikers. Elena felt that the mountains were the only place where the noise of modern life finally fell silent, leaving her with the raw, honest reality of the stone in the sky. In the weeks leading up to her departure for Marrakesh, she had spent every evening at the local climbing gym, strengthening her lungs and her grip for the high-altitude terrain. She had purchased a new, high-altitude tent and a sleeping bag rated for 40 degrees below zero, ensuring she was prepared for the unpredictable winter weather of the Atlas. She told her mother that she wasn't looking for adventure, but for a specific kind of stillness that only exists above 4,000 meters. She arrived in Imlal with a stack of handwritten notes and a series of coordinates she had mapped out using the most recent satellite data available in 1995. The guest house owner, a man named Brahim, noted that she was polite but distant, preferring to eat her meals alone while studying her maps by the light of a small candle. She spent her first 2 days in the village, acclimatizing to the elevation, walking short distances along the lower trails with a pack filled with heavy stones. Elena had a ritual of singing softly to herself while she hiked, a habit she claimed kept her breathing steady and her mind focused on the rhythm of the trail. She was not a risk-taker by nature, and she had carefully studied the signs of altitude sickness and pulmonary edema to ensure she knew when to turn back. Her preparation was a shield she built against the unpredictability of the natural world, a way of exerting control over an environment that is famously indifferent to human life. She spent her final evening in the guest house cleaning her stove and organizing her dehydrated rations into neat, labeled bags for each day of the ascent. She wrote a final letter to her younger brother, describing the way the starlight looked against the snow and the smell of juniper wood burning in the village hearths. There was no sign of distress or anxiety in her writing, only the calm, clinical observations of a woman who was exactly where she wanted to be. Her backpack was a marvel of organization, with every piece of equipment having a dedicated and logical place that she could find, even in total darkness. She carried a lightweight camera and 3 rolls of film, intending to document the light as it changed across the southern ridges of the Massif. Elena viewed her photography as a way of capturing the geometry of the mountains, focusing on the sharp lines of the ridges rather than the softness of the valleys below. She had a deep respect for the local Berber culture, having spent months studying the basics of their language and the history of the mountain tribes. She carried a small, carved wooden talisman given to her by a friend in Lyon, which she tucked into the hip belt of her pack for good luck. Despite her solitude, she felt a connection to the generations of people who had survived in these harsh conditions, viewing her trek as a small tribute to their endurance. The morning of her departure was cold and clear, with the air so crisp it felt like breathing in shards of frozen glass. Elena shared a brief breakfast of bread and honey with Brahim, nodding her thanks as she shouldered her heavy pack and stepped out into the gray, pre-dawn light. She looked toward the trailhead with a faint smile, her boots crunching rhythmically on the frozen mud of the village path as she began the long climb upward. She moved with a steady, unhurried pace that suggested she was settling in for a long and difficult journey. To those who watched her from the windows of the village, she looked like a small, yellow dot moving against the vast, gray canvas of the mountainside. I have seen that kind of focus before, where the world beyond the next 10 steps simply ceases to exist for the traveler. She didn't look back once, her eyes fixed firmly on the ridgeline that separated the village from the high, wild country beyond. 3 days into her trek, the weather in the high Atlas took a sudden and violent turn as a massive cold front swept in from the Atlantic. The temperature in Imlil dropped 20 degrees in a single hour, and the sky turned a bruised, heavy purple that signaled the arrival of a major blizzard. At the guest house, Brahim began to worry, knowing that the trails above the village would be erased by the shifting snow and the blinding whiteout conditions. According to local witnesses, Elena returned to the outskirts of the village late that evening, but she did not go back to her guest house. Instead, a local woman reported seeing a figure moving through the shadows of a neighboring courtyard where a wedding had recently taken place. The figure was moving with a strange, Yerki energy, reaching out to snag a long, ceremonial white caftan that had been hung on a line to dry. The white fabric fluttered in the rising wind like the wings of a trapped bird as the figure pulled it down. The next morning, as the blizzard began to howl through the narrow stone alleys of Imlil, a mountain guide named Omar spotted a strange sight on the ridge above the village. He saw a woman dressed not in hiking gear, but in a flowing, brilliant white wedding robe, running upward into the heart of the storm. She was not carrying her yellow backpack, and she appeared to be barefoot as she moved through the deepening snow toward the Tupkal Massif. Omar shouted to her, his voice lost in the roar of the wind, but the woman did not turn or acknowledge his presence. She moved with an impossible speed, her white robes billowing around her until she looked like a fragment of the blizzard itself. She was chanting in a high, rhythmic tone, a language that sounded to Omar like the ancient Berber dialects, spoken only in the most remote, forgotten corners of the range. The sound was cold and sharp, cutting through the heavy thrum of the falling snow. The guide watched in a state of paralyzed confusion as the white shape reached the edge of a steep precipice and continued to climb toward the clouds. The white caftan was a stark, unnatural brightness against the gray rock, making her visible even as the visibility dropped to less than 10 meters. Elena was ascending toward the highest peaks during a period of extreme, sub-zero weather with no boots, no quat, and no supplies. Brahim and a group of local men organized a search party as soon as the wind died down enough to allow them to stand on the ridges. They found Elena's guest house room exactly as she had left it, with her passport, her money, and her leather-bound journal sitting untouched on the small wooden table. Her yellow backpack was found leaning against a rock a mile outside the village, carefully packed and bolted shut, as if she had simply decided she no longer needed it. The Gendarmerie Royale arrived with dogs and thermal imaging equipment, but the mountain refused to reveal any trace of the woman in white. They searched the lower slopes and the known crevasses, but the fresh snow had covered every footprint and every clue within minutes of her disappearance. The searchers felt a sense of heavy, suffocating dread as they moved through the silent, white landscape, where every rock looked like a crouching figure. Despite a week-long search involving dozens of local tribesmen who knew every cave and overhang in the Atlas, not a single scrap of the white fabric was found. A wedding caftan of that size and brightness should have been easy to spot against the dark stone or the blue shadows of the snow. Yet it had vanished completely. It was as if the woman in the robe had been woven directly into the fabric of the storm and carried away to the heights. The local villagers began to whisper about the White Lady, a figure from mountain folklore who appears during blizzards to lead travelers into the high crevasses. They believed that Elena had not snapped, but rather that she had been called by the mountain spirits to join them in the permanent winter of the peaks. This explanation, while comforting to the locals, offered no solace to the French investigators who were looking for a logical, physical outcome. One of the most baffling details for the gendarmerie was the report of her chanting in a language she could not possibly have known. Elena's notes showed she had studied basic phrases for trade and navigation, but the witnesses described a complex, archaic tongue that seemed to resonate with the stone itself. The sounds were described as being less like human speech and more like the grinding of ice or the whistling of wind through a narrow canyon. The search teams eventually reached the Toubkal Massif, climbing through deep powder that reached their waists in the narrow passes. They found no signs of a fall, no disturbed snow, and no evidence that anyone had passed through the area during the height of the blizzard. The mountain felt empty and cold, a vast cathedral of stone that held its secrets with a relentless and unwavering grip. The wind had scrubbed the ridges clean, leaving nothing but the raw, polished surface of the ice. French investigators speculated that Elena had suffered from a sudden and catastrophic case of high-altitude cerebral edema, leading to a total psychological collapse. They argued that her behavior, the theft of the robe and the flight into the storm, was a classic symptom of the brain swelling and losing the ability to process reality. In her final moments, she might have felt an intense, burning heat, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, that often precedes death by hypothermia. However, this theory did not account for her speed or the fact that she was moving upward into the most difficult terrain rather than descending toward the warmth of the village. A person in the final stages of hypothermia is typically disoriented and sluggish, struggling to move even a few feet through the snow. Elena had moved like a gazelle, ascending hundreds of meters of vertical gain in a matter of minutes, according to the final sightings by the villagers. I want you to imagine standing on that ridge, the wind tearing at your clothes, and the cold sinking into your bones until you can no longer feel your own heart. You look up and see a flash of white, a garment that shouldn't be there, moving with a grace that defies the laws of physics and biology. You realize in that moment that the mountain is not just a pile of rock, but a living presence that has decided to take something back for itself. The search was officially called off when a second storm moved in, burying the massif under another 2 meters of fresh, heavy snow. Elena's family traveled from Lyon to Imlil, standing at the trailhead and looking up at the peaks that had swallowed their daughter without a trace. They left her yellow backpack with Brahim, a silent memorial to a woman who had spent her life looking for a stillness that she eventually found in the most terrifying way possible. The leather-bound journal remained the only window into her mind, but the final entry was dated the night before she left the guest house for the first time. It contained a single, neatly written sentence at the bottom of the page that read, "The lines are finally beginning to blur." There was no explanation for the remark, and the ink was steady and clear, suggesting a mind that was perfectly calm when the words were written. Through 2026, Elena remains officially missing, and her body has never been recovered from the high Atlas. Despite the significant retreat of the mountain glaciers over the last 30 years due to rising global temperatures, no clothing or equipment has ever surfaced in the meltwater. She was declared dead in absentia by a French court, but in the village of Imlil, she remains a living legend, a ghost who appears whenever the sky turns purple before a storm. The case file in Marrakesh has yellowed with age, containing only the conflicting testimonies of the villagers and the grainy photographs of a yellow backpack. There are no new leads, no DNA evidence, and no digital footprints to follow into the whiteout of the 1995 blizzard. Elena is a part of the mountain now, a fragment of the wind and the snow that continues to sing its cold, archaic song to anyone brave enough to listen. The mountain remains a place of profound and dangerous beauty, where the line between a missing person and a local ghost story can disappear in a single afternoon. It is a world where the earth can reach up and pull a human life into its heart, leaving only a white echo behind on the ridge. The silence of the high Atlas is absolute, a permanent weight that presses down on the valley of Imlil like the memory of a woman who ran toward the sky. The ethereal, haunting disappearance on a Moroccan peak is a sharp contrast to the suffocating, urban horror of a wealthy home in Bolivia. It is a transition from the vast, open cold of the mountains to the cramped, sand-filled crawl space beneath a glass floor where a woman is being watched like a specimen. In August of 1996, the air in Santa Cruz de la Sierra was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive perfume. Inside one of the city's most exclusive mansions, a gala was in full swing, with the sound of laughter and clinking crystal echoing off the high, marble walls. Guests moved through the conservatory, their silhouettes blurred by the steam rising from the indoor fountains and the warm, golden glow of the chandeliers. It was a night of absolute luxury, where the elite of Bolivian society gathered to celebrate art, wealth, and the effortless grace of their host. Lucia was 19 years old and spent her days immersed in the world of blueprints and structural integrity at the local university. She was a second-year architecture student with a passion for how spaces could influence the human spirit, often filling her sketchbooks with designs for sun-drenched libraries and open-air markets. Her professors noted that she had a rare eye for detail, a girl who noticed the way shadows moved across a brick wall or the specific resonance of a wooden floor underfoot. She lived with her mother in a modest apartment near the city center, where the kitchen always smelled of toasted corn and fresh cilantro. Every morning at exactly 7:45, Lucia would stand at the same bus stop on the corner of Avenida Bush, her backpack heavy with drafting tools and rolls of tracing paper. She had a ritual of wearing a specific silver locket that her father had given her, a small piece of jewelry that she would absent-mindedly rub whenever she was deep in thought. She was a creature of habit, a young woman who found comfort in the predictable rhythm of her city, the shouting of the street vendors, the rattle of the old blue buses, and the familiar faces of the other commuters. She was well liked by her classmates for her quiet kindness and her willingness to stay late in the studio to help anyone struggling with a difficult model. Lucia dreamed of one day designing a community center for the children in the poorer districts of the city, a place where they could feel the same sense of wonder that she found in great buildings. She spent her weekends volunteering at a local youth program, teaching kids how to build simple structures out of cardboard and glue. Her life was a series of purposeful steps toward a future where she could improve the lives of others through the art of design. She was a girl who looked at a vacant lot and saw a playground, a girl who saw a blank wall and imagined a mural that told the story of her people. Her mother, Maria, relied on Lucia's steady presence and her infectious, soft laugh that seemed to brighten even the darkest rooms of their small home. They had plans to travel to the coast once Lucia finished her degree, a trip they had been saving for since she was a little girl. Lucia had already mapped out the entire route, marking the specific cathedrals and plazas she wanted to study along the way. She was the anchor of her family, a daughter who remembered every birthday and who always made sure there were fresh flowers on the dining table on Sunday afternoons. In her spare time, Lucia loved to walk through the public parks of Santa Cruz, sketching the grand old trees and the families who gathered beneath their shade. She found beauty in the mundane, in the way a grandmother held a child's hand or the patterns made by fallen leaves on a stone path. She was deeply connected to her environment, feeling the pulse of the city as if it were her own heartbeat. Her sketchbooks were more than just schoolwork. They were a record of a young woman who was falling in love with the world and her place within it. She was a dedicated runner, often seen jogging through the streets in the early morning before the heat became oppressive and the traffic began to choke the avenues. Lucia enjoyed the feeling of her lungs burning and the rhythmic strike of her shoes against the pavement, a physical reminder that she was alive and moving forward. She had a specific route that took her past the university and down toward the river, where the air was cooler and the light was always soft and pale. She was a girl in motion, a life that was unfolding with a grace and a clarity that many of her peers envied. Lucia also had a fascination with the history of Bolivian architecture, spending hours in the dusty archives of the municipal library. She wanted to understand how the materials of the earth, the clay, the stone, and the timber could be transformed into something that lasted for centuries. She felt that buildings were the memory of a culture, and she wanted to be one of the people who helped preserve those memories for the generations to come. Her commitment to her studies was unwavering, fueled by a deep desire to leave a mark on the world that was both beautiful and functional. On a Tuesday afternoon in early February, Lucia left the university library later than usual, the sun already beginning to dip behind the sprawling outskirts of the city. She hurried toward her bus stop, her mind filled with the complex calculations for a structural engineering exam she had scheduled for the following morning. The street was unusually quiet, the heavy humidity of the afternoon keeping most people indoors or under the shade of the plaza trees. She reached the corner and checked her watch, realizing she had just missed the 7 o'clock bus and would have to wait 15 minutes for the next one. A sleek, dark sedan pulled over to the curb just a few feet away from where Lucia was standing, its engine idling with a low, expensive purr. A woman with a polished, aristocratic air rolled down the window and asked Lucia for directions to a nearby art gallery that had recently opened. The woman was Sophia, a prominent socialite known for her immense wealth and her erratic, high-concept contributions to the local art scene. She spoke with a soft, persuasive tone that immediately put Lucia at ease. Despite the isolation of the quiet street, Sophia explained that she was running late for an opening and offered Lucia a ride in exchange for her help in finding the correct turnoff. Lucia hesitated for a moment, thinking of her mother waiting at home, but the woman's elegance and the apparent sincerity of her request made her feel that it would be rude to refuse. She stepped into the cool, leather-scented interior of the car, and the door closed with a heavy, muffled click that seemed to shut out the noise of the city. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, Lucia felt a brief, inexplicable shiver of unease, but she quickly dismissed it as she began to give the woman directions. That was the last time anyone saw Lucia for 200 days. Her mother called the police that evening when Lucia didn't arrive home for dinner, but the initial investigation produced no leads and no witnesses. The bus stop was empty, her sketchbooks were gone, and her university friends knew only that she had left the library as she did every other day. Lucia had simply vanished into the golden light of the Santa Cruz afternoon, leaving behind a mother who sat by the window every night, waiting for a daughter who never returned. Back at the gala in August, a catering worker named Roberto was moving through the conservatory with a tray of empty champagne flutes. He was a young man who had worked many of these high society events, and he had learned to navigate the crowds with a silent, invisible efficiency. As he neared the center of the room, he noticed a guest spill a drink onto the reinforced glass floor that served as a centerpiece for the sunroom. Roberto knelt down with a white cloth to clean the spill, his eyes focused on the liquid as it moved across the polished surface. As he wiped the glass, a sudden movement in the shadows beneath his hand caught his eye, a flicker of something white and thin against a background of dark sand. He paused, his heart skipping a beat as he pressed his face closer to the transparent floor, trying to make out what lay in the shallow crawl space below. The lighting in the pit was dim and amber, designed to highlight the texture of the sand and the geometric patterns etched into the concrete walls. Then, he saw a human hand, the fingers curling slowly into a fist before relaxing back into the grit. Roberto felt a cold wave of shock wash over him as a pair of wide, unblinking eyes stared back at him from less than a meter below the glass. The person in the pit was a young woman, her face pale and drawn, her hair a matted tangle that partially obscured her features. She was lying in a space so shallow that she couldn't even sit upright, her body pressed against the sand like a preserved specimen in a cabinet. Roberto dropped his cloth, the white fabric fluttering onto the glass as he stared in horror at the living person beneath the feet of the celebrating guests. Sophia, the hostess, noticed the commotion and glided over to Roberto with a practiced, serene smile that didn't reach her eyes. She placed a hand on his shoulder and explained in a loud, clear voice that the woman in the pit was a volunteer for a prolonged endurance piece. She told the surrounding guests that it was a high-concept art installation, exploring the themes of human isolation and the invisibility of the lower classes in modern society. Some of the guests nodded in appreciation, admiring the commitment of the performer and the daring vision of the heiress who had curated the scene. However, Roberto saw something in the girl's eyes that didn't look like performance. He saw a raw, animal terror that could not be faked for the sake of art. He noticed a thick, black band around the girl's neck, an electronic collar that hummed with a faint, low-frequency vibration whenever she tried to open her mouth. The crawl space was equipped with mood lights that cast long, distorted shadows across the sand, making the girl look like a ghost trapped in a crystal coffin. Roberto backed away, his mind reeling as the music from the gala continued to thump through the floor. It is a terrifying reality that people can look directly at a human being in pain and choose to see a concept instead. I find that more chilling than the glass itself. The guests continued to step over the pit, their laughter vibrating through the glass while Lucia lay in the silence below. Watching the soles of their shoes, she had become a literal foundation for their evening. A hidden secret that was being presented as a cultural milestone to the very people who should have been her rescuers. Roberto didn't go back to the kitchen. Instead, he slipped out the back service entrance and ran to the nearest police station, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He told the officers about the girl under the glass, describing the electronic collar and the sand-filled pit in the heiress's mansion. At first, the police were skeptical, knowing Sophia's reputation for eccentric behavior and her deep connections to the city's political elite. But something in Roberto's frantic desperation convinced a young detective to organize a welfare check at the estate that very night. When the police arrived, the gala was still in progress, the music spilling out into the manicured gardens in the night air. They moved through the crowd, their uniforms a stark contrast to the formal wear of the guests, and headed straight for the conservatory. Sophia tried to block their path, her voice rising in a sharp, defensive tone as she spoke of artistic freedom and the sanctity of her private home. The detective ignored her and knelt on the glass floor, shining a heavy flashlight into the crawl space where Lucia was lying. The beam of light revealed the full horror of the installation, showing a space less than 4 meters long and barely a meter deep. Lucia blinked in the sudden brightness, her hand rising to shield her eyes as the officers began to work on the bolts that held the glass panels in place. The guests watched in a stunned, uncomfortable silence as the art began to transform back into a human tragedy right before their eyes. It took 4 men to lift the heavy, reinforced glass, the sound of the metal grinding against the stone echoing through the quieted room. You are lying on your side in 2 inches of coarse sand, your cheek pressed against the grit while the soles of Italian leather shoes click inches above your eyes. The air is stagnant and smells of recycled ozone and old sweat. And every time you try to scream, the collar around your neck pulses with a white-hot pain. You have forgotten the sound of your own voice, replaced by the constant, dull vibration of the house above you and the mocking glare of the golden lights. The world is a flat, transparent ceiling that you can never touch, and the people above are just shadows moving through a dream you are no longer a part of. As the glass was removed, the smell of the pit wafted into the room, a mixture of bleach, sand, and the sour scent of prolonged captivity. Lucia was so weak that she had to be lifted out by the officers, her limbs thin and brittle like dry branches. She clung to the detective's jacket, her fingers digging into the fabric as if she were afraid she would fall back into the earth if she let go. She wondered if the bus driver still looked for her at 7:45. The police raid moved into the basement of the mansion, where they found the control center for the terrarium. There was a specialized feeding tube disguised as a floor vent that Sophia used to deliver liquid nutrients and water to the crawl space twice a day. They also found the remote control for the electronic collar, a device designed to deliver a high-voltage shock whenever the sensors detected a certain decibel level of sound. Sophia had created a prison that allowed her to keep a human being in a state of total, enforced silence while she was on full display. The investigation revealed that Sophia had hired a professional stage lighting technician to install the mood lights and the ventilation system for the pit. The technician later admitted to police that he had been told it was for a high-end theatrical project and that the performer would be rotated out every few hours. He had never seen Lucia during the day, as Sophia only allowed him access to the conservatory late at night when the girl was sedated. Sophia had manipulated everyone around her, using the language of the 90s art world to mask a sadistic and calculated kidnapping. Lucia had been kept in that space for 200 days, never seeing the sun and never feeling a breath of fresh air. She had watched the seasons change through the glass roof of the conservatory, seeing the rain wash away the dust and the stars move across the night sky. She had memorized the patterns of the guests' shoes and the rhythms of their conversations, knowing which guests were kind and which were prone to spilling their drinks. She had survived by retreating into her own mind, designing elaborate buildings in her head that she knew she might never get to build. Sophia's defense team attempted to argue that the heiress was suffering from a severe psychological break and that she truly believed Lucia was a willing participant. They brought in expert witnesses to talk about the dangers of extreme performance art and the way it could blur the lines of reality for the artist. However, the evidence of the electronic collar and the feeding tube suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond a mental lapse. Sophia had targeted Lucia because she was a girl with no power, a girl whose disappearance wouldn't cause an immediate national scandal. The case sent shockwaves through Bolivia, exposing the terrifying ease with which the wealthy could prey on the vulnerable and hide their crimes behind a veneer of culture. It sparked a massive protest outside the courthouse, with thousands of people demanding justice for Lucia and a complete overhaul of the legal system that had protected Sophia's family for generations. The human terrarium became a symbol of the class divide in Santa Cruz, a literal representation of one group of people walking on the heads of another. Lucia's sketchbooks were never found, likely destroyed by Sophia to erase any trace of the girl's former life. Sophia was eventually sentenced to 30 years in a high-security prison, a verdict that was seen as a major victory for the people of the city. Despite her family's wealth and influence, the sheer brutality of her crime made it impossible for the magistrate to offer a lighter sentence. She went to prison with the same cold, detached expression she had worn at the gala, refusing to offer an apology or any sign of remorse for what she had done to Lucia. She remained a woman who saw the world as a stage and other people as nothing more than props for her own amusement. Lucia survived her ordeal, but the physical and psychological scars remained with her long after she was pulled from the sand. She suffered from chronic light sensitivity and a profound fear of open spaces, often feeling exposed and vulnerable whenever she wasn't under a solid roof. She moved to a small town in Europe with her mother, where she underwent years of intensive therapy and reconstructive surgery to repair the damage to her vocal cords. She never returned to architecture school, finding the study of spaces to be too painful, a reminder of the one space she could never forget. She eventually found peace in a different kind of art, working with textiles and weaving intricate patterns that allowed her to express the silence she had lived in for so long. She lived a quiet, private life, far from the glare of the sunrooms and the judgment of the high society galas. Lucia chose to remain anonymous, a woman who had been a concept for others, but who was now, finally, a person for herself. She still rubs the spot where her father's locket used to sit, a habit that she can't quite break after all these years. Through 2026, Sophia remains incarcerated in a facility in La Paz, where she is reportedly a difficult and isolated prisoner who refuses to interact with the other inmates. Lucia is now in her late 40s and lives in a secluded cottage in the French countryside, where the air is cool and the only sounds are the rustle of the trees and the birds in the eaves. She has never spoken publicly about her time in the pit, preferring to let her weaving tell the story of her survival and her slow steady return to the world of the living. The case of the Santa Cruz human terrarium is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who greet us with a smile and a refined accent. It is a story of a life that was paused in a shallow grave made of glass and sand, and the incredible strength it took to start moving again. The mansion was eventually seized by the government and turned into a memorial for the victims of human trafficking. Its glass floor replaced with solid unyielding stone that can no longer be seen through. The suffocating, man-made horror of a Bolivian crawlspace is a world away from the industrial, state-sanctioned darkness of a hidden bunker in the Iraqi marshes. It is a transition from the glare of mood lights and champagne to the cold, glossy crimson of a room designed to make the end of a human life invisible. In late 1996, the Alfau Peninsula was a landscape of salt-crusted marshes and stagnant pools where the Tigris and Euphrates finally bled into the Persian Gulf. A low-slung agricultural building sat near the edge of a crumbling irrigation canal, its mud brick walls indistinguishable from the dozen others scattered across the southern wetlands. The wind off the water carried the scent of wet earth and rot, but inside the structure, the air was perfectly still and heavy with the smell of old stone. In the city of Basra, only a short distance to the north, a man named Ahmed spent his days working as a junior clerk in the municipal records office. He was 42 years old, a man whose life was defined by the neat stacks of paper on his desk and the precise, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Ahmed was a quiet figure who avoided the crowded tea houses, preferring to walk home in the evening to the small, sun-drenched courtyard where his 3 children played among the lemon trees. Ahmed's wife, Laila, was a woman of infinite patience who could stretch a single bag of rice across a week of dinners without anyone ever feeling a lack of warmth in the home. She spent her afternoons sewing intricate patterns into linen cloths, her needle moving with a steady confidence that mirrored the calm stability Ahmed provided for the family. They lived in a world where safety was measured by silence and the ability to remain entirely invisible to the men who patrolled the city in olive green uniforms. The children were the center of Ahmed's universe, and he spent his meager savings on colored pencils and drawing paper so they could map out the worlds they saw in their dreams. He would sit with them on the floor after the evening meal, listening to their stories of flying machines and cities made of glass that didn't crumble under the weight of history. He taught them that a man's true wealth was found in his books and the integrity of his word, values he held dearer than any currency. Every Friday, Ahmed would take the family for a walk along the Shat al-Arab, watching the heavy tankers move slowly toward the sea while he pointed out the different birds in the reeds. He possessed a deep knowledge of the local wildlife, often telling his son the names of the herons and the kingfishers that inhabited the marshes. These walks were the highlight of his week, a brief period where the pressure of the regime seemed to lift, replaced by the simple, honest joy of being a father. Ahmed was a man of strict routine, rising every morning at 5 to perform his prayers before the city noise began to drown out the sound of the wind. He found a profound comfort in the repetition of his life, viewing each uneventful day as a small victory against the chaos that often simmered just beneath the surface of the country. He never spoke of politics and never complained about the shortages, believing that as long as his door remained locked, his family was safe from the world. In his office, Ahmed was known for his discretion and his ability to file documents so efficiently that they seemed to vanish into the archives without leaving a trace. He saw names come and go through the ledgers, men who were there one day and gone the next, their entire existence summarized by a single red line through a page. He never asked where they went, and he never looked at the faces of the families who came to the window, asking for information that he was not allowed to give. He had a quiet passion for history, often spending his lunch breaks reading old accounts of the Ottoman administrators who had once occupied the very same building where he now worked. He felt a kinship with those men, understanding the specialized burden of maintaining order in a place where the rules were constantly shifting and the consequences of a mistake were absolute. He viewed himself as a witness to time, a man whose only job was to ensure that the records remained clean and the ink remained dark. At home, he was currently helping his eldest daughter study for her exams. Sitting at the small wooden table while the cicadas hummed in the heat outside, he watched her concentrate, her brow furrowing just as his did, and felt a surge of pride that nearly brought tears to his eyes. He imagined her going to the university in Baghdad, becoming a doctor or a teacher who would help build a version of the country that didn't require so much silence to survive. He often woke in the middle of the night to check the latches on the windows, his movements silent so as not to disturb the breathing of his sleeping family. The darkness of the house was a familiar companion, a space where he could let down his guard and allow himself to feel the true weight of the world he inhabited. He was a man who lived with a permanent, low-level vibration of fear in his chest, one that he masked with a gentle smile and a steady hand. His daughter once asked him why he never sang aloud like the men in the market, and Ahmed had simply touched her hair and told her that some songs are meant to be kept in the heart. He understood that in Basra, a loud voice was a target, and he was determined to keep his family out of the sights of anyone who might wish them harm. His love was expressed through the things he didn't say and the risks he refused to take, a quiet and relentless devotion to the people he cherished. On a Tuesday evening in late September, the family was sitting down to a meal of flatbread and lentils when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the small courtyard. Ahmed felt the air leave his lungs in a single, cold rush, his eyes meeting Layla's for a fraction of a second before he stood up to answer the door. He told the children to stay in their seats, his voice sounding thin and unfamiliar, even to his own ears as he moved toward the heavy wooden gate. 3 men in dark suits stood in the street, their faces expressionless and their eyes hidden behind the dark glass of the sedan parked at the curb. They didn't show any identification, but Ahmed recognized the cold, professional posture of the internal security services, the Mukhabarat, who operated with a terrifying and absolute autonomy. One of the men spoke in a low, politetone, informing Ahmed that there was a discrepancy in the municipal records that required his immediate and personal clarification. Ahmed turned to see Layla standing in the doorway, her hands trembling as she clutched the frame, her eyes wide with a terror that she could no longer hide from the children. He told her it would only take an hour, a lie that hung in the humid air like a physical weight while the men waited for him to step into the car. He looked at his home one last time, the lemon trees glowing in the twilight, and then he was pulled into the dark interior of the sedan. Months later, a high-ranking defector arrived in Amman, carrying a leather satchel filled with coordinates and maps that he claimed led to the regime's most secret and brutal black sites. He spoke of locations in the southern marshes that appeared to be simple farms but were, in reality, specialized facilities used for the final processing of political prisoners. Among his documents was a sketch of a building on the Al-Fa Peninsula, a place he described as the Red Room, where the records were finished forever. A team of clandestine investigators and human rights observers traveled to the peninsula under the cover of a local salt mining operation, their eyes fixed on the low-slung building near the canal. They found the structure abandoned, the mud bricks crumbling into the mud and the irrigation ditch filled with stagnant, oily water. Inside, there was nothing but a few broken crates and a heavy wooden floor that felt oddly solid beneath their heavy boots when they began to pry up the boards. Beneath the floorboards, they discovered a reinforced concrete bunker, its entrance, a narrow set of stairs that descended into a humid, lightless void. As they moved down with their flashlights, the beam caught a color that was so intense and so jarring that it caused the lead investigator to stop mid-step. The entire chamber, the floor, the ceiling, and all 4 walls was painted in a deep, glossy, and sickeningly bright shade of crimson that seemed to vibrate under the artificial light. The Red Room was a windowless box of reinforced concrete, designed to be completely soundproof and invisible from the world above the marshes. Observation: the logs were not just records. They were an inventory of shadows, detailing the final moments of hundreds of families who had been erased by the state. The investigators found a stack of meticulously kept ledgers on a small metal table, their pages filled with the neat, professional handwriting of a man who viewed death as a simple clerical error. The logs from 1995 and 1996 detailed a chillingly efficient process where prisoners were told they were being relocated to a new, modern facility with better food and medical care. They were led into the Red Room in small groups, often as entire families, under the guise of being processed for their new living quarters. The dim emergency lights in the room were designed to disorient the victims, making the crimson walls look like a limitless, terrifying void that stretched on forever. You are standing in a space where the air is thick with the metallic tang of old paint and the smell of industrial chemicals that have soaked into the very pores of the concrete. The only light comes from a single, low-wattage bulb overhead that turns the red walls into a deep, pulsing purple that makes your head swim and your stomach turn. You realize that there is no door handle on the inside of the room, and the floor beneath your feet is sloped toward a central, dark drain that leads to nowhere. Inner thought Ahmed stood in the center of the red void, holding his daughter's hand and thinking that at least the new facility would have enough light for her to finish her drawings. He had believed the men in the olive uniforms because the alternative was a reality that his mind simply refused to process in front of his children. He watched the shadows move against the crimson walls, waiting for the clerk to return with the papers that would finally grant them their freedom. The investigation revealed that the Red Room was equipped with a specialized, high-tension wire system that operated in total silence to avoid alerting the prisoners waiting in the trucks outside. The victims were positioned in the center of the room, and the wires were triggered from a separate observation booth hidden behind a one-way mirror in the far corner. It was a method of execution that was clean, fast, and required no ammunition, leaving the site as quiet as the marshes that surrounded it. The drainage system in the center of the room was connected to a hidden septic tank buried deep in the mud, filled with high concentrations of caustic lime. This chemical was used to dissolve the remains of the families, ensuring that no physical evidence of the executions would ever be found by future generations of investigators. The names in the logs did not match any official prison registry in Basra or Baghdad, as the victims were disappeared before they were even formally recorded in the state's system. The investigators found a single, small silver locket near the central drain. Its chain snapped, and its metal tarnished by the chemicals that had once flooded the room. It was the only personal item left behind in a facility designed to strip away every trace of human identity and memory. The red paint had been applied in multiple layers over several years, each coat hiding the spray of blood that would have otherwise marked the concrete walls of the chamber. The perpetrators of the Alpha executions were never identified, as the personnel records for the site were destroyed by the Mukhabarat just before the site was abandoned. The guards and the technicians who operated the high-tension wires vanished back into the general population, their identities protected by the same regime that had ordered the killings. The Red Room was a machine of state sadism that functioned with a terrifying, professional indifference to the lives it consumed in the darkness of the marshes. In early 1997, the Iraqi military returned to the Alfa Peninsula with heavy machinery and a team of demolition experts. They leveled the agricultural building and filled the concrete bunker with rubble, before capping the entire site with a layer of thick, industrial cement. The canal was diverted to flood the area, turning the ground into a permanent swamp that was impossible to excavate without specialized, underwater equipment that the local authorities didn't possess. Through 2026, the site remains a restricted military zone, and the families of the disappeared have never received an official accounting of what happened to their loved ones. The names in the leaked logs remain unmatched to any official registry, leaving hundreds of people in a state of permanent, agonizing uncertainty. The Red Room of Al-Fa is a cold case of state-sanctioned horror, a place where the records were closed in crimson and then buried beneath the mud of the South. The marsh birds still circle over the site of the bunker, their cries, the only sound in a landscape that has forgotten the people who once walked there. The lemon trees in the courtyards of Basra have grown old or been cut down, but the memory of the silence remains in the hearts of those who survived. The Red Room is a reminder that the most efficient way to erase a human life is to turn it into a single line of ink in a ledger that no one is allowed to read. The brutal, state-sanctioned silence of a crimson bunker in Iraq is a world away from the refined and performative violence of a private gallery in Sydney. It is a transition from the cold efficiency of a government machine to the twisted, geometric patterns of a killer who uses blood as a medium for an artwork that was never meant to be seen. On a crisp Tuesday morning in September 1996, Michael Sullivan stood in the center of his private gallery in Paddington, Sydney, and carefully straightened the frame of a 17th-century Dutch landscape. He was 48 years old and possessed the kind of quiet, understated elegance that only comes from a lifetime of handling objects more valuable than most people's homes. Michael lived a life defined by the high-stakes silence of the international art world, where a single nod of the head could move millions of dollars across borders without a trace. He was known in the exclusive circles of Sydney as a man with an infallible eye and a heart of polished flint. His gallery was not just a business, it was a sanctuary of high culture, protected by the latest biometric security and a reputation for absolute discretion. Michael's home was a minimalist penthouse overlooking the harbor, filled with glass walls and the kind of sparse, expensive furniture that made a visitor feel like they were standing in a museum. Every evening at 6, he poured himself a 2-finger measure of vintage Highland Scotch and sat in total silence, watching the ferries trace white lines across the dark water. Michael had spent the better part of 2 decades building his empire on a foundation of hidden histories and the quiet exchange of stolen antiquities. He was the man the wealthy called when they wanted a piece of history that wasn't supposed to be for sale. Someone who knew exactly which customs officials to bypass and which collectors were desperate enough to sell. He moved through the world with a cool, untouchable confidence, believing that as long as he maintained his poise, the dark undercurrents of his trade could never pull him under. His phone only rang for those who possessed the right code, and his calendar was a ledger of secret meetings in the back rooms of 5-star hotels. Despite his ruthless business sense, he was a man of genuine, almost obsessive refinement. He could spend an entire afternoon discussing the specific pigment of a Renaissance blue or the tension in the stroke of a calligraphy brush. Michael didn't just sell art, he inhabited it, surrounding himself with beauty as a shield against the grime and chaos of the city outside. He had no children and no permanent partners, viewing human relationships as unpredictable variables that could not be curated or controlled like a masterpiece. His only true loyalty was to the objects he owned and the legacy of prestige he had meticulously carved out of the Sydney elite. He was a creature of rigid, predictable habits that gave his life a sense of unshakable order. Every morning, he walked the 3 blocks from his penthouse to the gallery, stopping at the same small cafe for a black coffee and a single sourdough roll. He enjoyed the anonymity of the morning commute, watching the city wake up while he remained a ghost in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Michael believed that if you knew where a man walked and what he ate, you knew his weaknesses. So he ensured his own vulnerabilities were buried deep beneath layers of habit and ironclad security. His private viewing room at the back of the gallery was his true inner sanctum, a space reinforced with steel and accessible only through a biometric palm scanner. This was where he kept the pieces that were too dangerous to display the looted gold of lost empires and the canvases that had been missing from European museums since the mid-century. The air in this room was always kept at exactly 18 degrees Celsius, with a constant humidity level to protect the fragile ghosts of the past. Michael often sat in there alone for hours, surrounded by the silent weight of things that officially did not exist. There was a profound, cold power in being the secret keeper for the world's most powerful collectors. Michael enjoyed the way men of immense political influence would sit on his velvet chairs and speak in hushed, pleading tones for the chance to own a piece of forbidden history. He was the gatekeeper of their desires, a position that required him to be both invisible and essential at the same time. He had mastered the art of the long pause and the subtle, knowing smile that could double the price of a painting in a single heartbeat. Inside his mind, he often compared himself to the great explorers of the 19th century, men who crossed borders to claim what the world had forgotten. He didn't see himself as a criminal, but as a preservationist of the highest order, someone who saved beauty from the messy hands of the public. One more acquisition, he thought, and the collection will be truly complete. It was a thought that kept him awake at night, a constant, low-level hunger for the one object that would finally satiate his need for perfection. In late August, he had received a mysterious tip regarding a blank 17th century canvas that had once belonged to a secret society of occultists in Prague. The seller had claimed the canvas was not meant for paint, but for a different kind of medium that would reveal the true nature of the owner. Michael had laughed at the superstition, but was captivated by the physical quality of the ancient fabric, which felt as smooth and cold as human skin. He had arranged for the delivery to be made directly to his private viewing room, bypassing his assistant entirely. On the night of September 14th, Michael stayed late at the gallery to receive the final crate of the season. The streets of Paddington were quiet, the usual hum of traffic replaced by the rhythmic drumming of a light. Spring rain against the high windows. He dismissed his security team early, telling them he had a private meeting with a high-profile client who insisted on total anonymity. Michael was used to working in the dark, finding a strange comfort in the way the gallery looked when the only lights were the ones aimed at the masterpieces. Sarah, his longtime assistant, arrived at 9 the following morning to find the front doors of the gallery unlocked and the lights in the main hall still burning bright. This was the first off-key detail that caused a sharp prick of anxiety to bloom in her chest. Michael was a man who never left a door unbolted and never wasted a single watt of energy on an empty room. She called out his name, her voice echoing off the white walls and the silent task, unblinking eyes of the portraits. But the only response was the steady hum of the climate control system. She moved toward the back of the gallery, her footsteps sounding like gunshots on the polished wood. As she reached the heavy steel door of the private viewing room, she noticed that the biometric scanner was glowing with a steady, green light, indicating that it was currently unlocked. This was an impossibility, as the system was programmed to automatically seal the room if it didn't detect a living heartbeat or a valid code for more than 10 minutes. Sarah pushed the door open, the heavy steel hinges moving with a silent, clinical ease. Companion voice, you can walk with her into that room, where the air is unnaturally cold and the light is focused entirely on a single point in the center of the dark space. The smell is the first thing that hits you, not the expected scent of old oil and turpentine, but something thick, metallic, and warm that seems to coat the back of your throat. In the center of the room, Michael Sullivan was sitting in his favorite leather armchair, his head tilted back as if he were deep in thought or perhaps admiring a piece of work he had just finished. Directly in front of him stood the blank 17th century canvas he had been so obsessed with for the past few weeks. But the canvas was no longer blank. It was covered in an intricate, swirling geometric pattern that looked like a piece of dark, calligraphic lace. The lines were so precise and fine that they seemed to be etched into the fabric rather than applied with a brush. The patterns were not made of ink or oil, but of Michael's own blood, which had been harvested through a single, clean incision made in his arm. He had been incapacitated and then bled out slowly into a silver bowl that now sat on the floor, perfectly centered between his feet and the easel. The killer had used a fine-tipped brush to create the artwork, spending what forensic experts later estimated to be at least 4 hours in the room with him. There was no sign of a struggle, and Michael's face was frozen in an expression of calm, detached curiosity. The police arrived within 15 minutes, their heavy boots and radio chatter shattering the carefully curated silence of the gallery. Detective Miller, a veteran of the Sydney Homicide Squad, stood before the canvas and felt a sensation of profound, creeping unease. He had seen thousands of crime scenes, but he had never seen a murder that looked so much like a deliberate act of creation. The blood on the canvas was still slightly tacky to the touch, the deep crimson turning a dark, brownish black as it dried in the filtered air. Investigation revealed that the biometric logs showed only Michael's own code and palm print had been used to enter and exit the room throughout the entire night. There were no foreign fingerprints on the door, the silver bowl, or the handle of the brush that lay neatly across the top of the easel. The security cameras in the main hall showed Michael entering the room alone at 10 o'clock the previous night, and the doors had remained closed until Sarah arrived the following morning. It was as if the killer had either been waiting inside the steel vault for days or had a way of bypassing the laws of physical space. Observation. The geometry on the canvas was a series of overlapping circles and squares that formed a pattern known in some occult circles as the cage of the soul. Forensic psychologists were brought in to analyze the painting, searching for a signature or a hidden message that would lead them to a suspect. They noted that the style mimicked a very specific 17th century geometric script used by a defunct secret society in Central Europe. The brushwork was described as being performed with a level of skill and patience that was almost superhuman, with not a single drop of blood out of place or smeared. The killer hadn't just murdered Michael, they had transformed him into the primary material for a final, horrific masterpiece. Despite the high security alarms and the presence of million-dollar Dutch masters hanging in the main hall just feet away, nothing in the gallery had been stolen. The vault remained full of looted gold, and the secret drawers of Michael's desk were still packed with high-denomination notes and sensitive documents. The motive was clearly not financial, but something far more personal and ritualistic. The killer had ignored the wealth of a lifetime to focus entirely on the destruction and reconfiguration of the man who had gathered it. Detective Miller spent weeks interviewing Michael's high society associates and the shadowy figures from his black market past. Every person he spoke to had a motive. Michael had made many enemies during his rise to the top of the art world, but every one of them had a solid, verifiable alibi. The more Miller dug into Michael's life, the more he realized that the art dealer had been a man with no true friends, only a network of temporary alliances built on mutual greed and fear. No one mourned him, they only wondered who would take over his lucrative connections. One theory that gained traction among the investigators was that Michael had been forced to grant access to the room by someone he trusted implicitly. They speculated that the killer might have been a longtime client or a rival who had finally decided to settle a decades-old debt in the most theatrical way possible. But even this didn't explain the biometric logs, which required a living, warm palm to be pressed against the glass sensor. The technology was supposed to be foolproof, designed to detect the lack of blood flow in a severed hand or a synthetic replica. The blood canvas itself became a point of obsession for the detectives and the forensic teams, who felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the swirling patterns. Several officers reported experiencing vivid, dark dreams after spending time in the evidence locker with the painting, claiming they could hear the sound of a brush scratching against fabric. The artwork seemed to possess a life of its own, the crimson lines appearing to shift and move whenever the viewer turned their head. Eventually, the department had to move the canvas to a separate, off-site facility to avoid the psychological toll it was taking on the staff. The investigation also focused on the mysterious Prague canvas that Michael had supposedly ordered, but no record of the purchase or the delivery could be found in any of his files. The shipping companies had no record of a crate being delivered to the Paddington address that night, and the occult society mentioned in the tip turned out to be a fiction. It appeared that Michael had been lured into his own vault by a phantom vault, a ghost story that had been specifically designed to appeal to his obsession with the forbidden and the unique. Earned reflection. I believe that some men spend so much time curating their own image that they eventually forget that a frame is also a kind of cage. Michael Sullivan had spent 48 years making himself untouchable, only to discover that the more you isolate yourself, the easier it is for someone to finish the picture without you. By the end of the year, the leads had entirely dried up, leaving the Sydney police with a mountain of forensic data and not a single viable suspect. The case of the art gallery murder became a whispered legend in the Paddington district, a story told to new recruits about the limits of technology and the depths of human depravity. Michael Sullivan's penthouse was sold. His collection was seized and eventually returned to various governments, and the gallery itself was shuttered for good. The high society world moved on to a new set of scandals, leaving the art dealer behind in the cold silence of the archives. In 2004, a court order was finally issued to destroy the blood canvas after it was determined that the object served no further investigative purpose and posed a risk to those who handled it. The fabric was incinerated in a specialized facility, the ancient threads turning to ash in a matter of seconds. Sarah, the assistant who had found him, was the only one who attended the destruction, watching the flames and wondering if the geometric patterns had finally been broken. She had never returned to the art world, preferring the simple, honest work of a community gardener. Through 2026, the murder of Michael Sullivan remains one of Australia's most bizarre and chilling cold cases. The biometric logs from that night have been analyzed by dozens of cybersecurity experts over the years, but no one has ever been able to explain the internal entry without a physical presence. The case file is now a digital record in the Unsolved Homicide Division, a sequence of ones and zeros that can never capture the smell of the room or the look in Michael's unblinking eyes. The Paddington Gallery was eventually liquidated, and the building was converted into high-end apartments. The walls repainted and the floors replaced to erase the memory of what happened in the viewing room. New residents moved through the hallways, their shoes clicking on the wood just as Michael's once did, unaware that they are living in the footprint of a masterpiece made of blood. The silence of the building is now the silence of the domestic and the mundane, the dark history of the site buried under layers of modern luxury and expensive paint. The performative, geometric violence of a Sydney art gallery is a world away from the frigid, blue silence of a riverbank in northern China. It is a transition from the smell of copper and oil to the sound of dripping water as a massive wall of ice begins to melt, revealing the faces of those who were used as the foundation for a palace. In the late morning of April 14th, 1996, in the northern city of Harbin, a worker named Wang adjusted his heavy cotton cap and wiped the sweat from his brow. The spring sun was finally beginning to assert itself over the Heilongjiang province, and the massive, frozen structures of the ice and snow world were starting to surrender to the heat. Wang carried a long iron pick and moved toward the base of a 10-meter-tall ice palace, his boots splashing in the growing puddles of meltwater that mirrored the pale blue sky. Wang had worked on the festival's demolition crew for 5 years, a job that required him to dismantle the very same wonders he had helped build only months before. He was a man of simple habits who lived in a small apartment with his aging mother, spending his evenings listening to the radio and drinking warm tea. He enjoyed the physical rhythm of the work, finding a quiet satisfaction in the way the heavy ice blocks shattered under the precise strike of his tool. Every morning, he would stop at a street stall for 2 steamed buns, watching the steam rise in the frigid air while he prepared for the day's labor. A few months earlier, in the crowded textile district of the city, a young woman named May was living a life that felt as bright as the festival lights. She was 21 years old and worked 10-hour shifts at a spinning mill, saving every possible yuan to send back to her family in the rural south. May was known for the small paper cranes she would fold during her lunch breaks, leaving them on the windowsills for her co-workers to find. She had a laugh that sounded like small bells and a dream of one day opening her own tailoring shop where she could design silk dresses for the city's wealthy elite. May spent her Sunday afternoons walking through the public parks, her breath hitching at the beauty of the frost-covered trees and the children sliding across the frozen ponds. She had a specific red wool coat that she wore only on special occasions, a garment that made her feel like she belonged in the sophisticated world of the northern capital. She was a daughter who wrote letters home every week, detailing the wonders of the city and promising that she would return for the spring festival with gifts for everyone. Her life was a series of careful plans and small kindnesses, a steady climb toward a future she could almost touch. Her best friend, Lee, remembered her as a girl who saw the world through a lens of persistent hope. Even when the winter nights were at their most unforgiving, May loved the smell of roasted chestnuts and the sound of the vendors shouting in the evening market, feeling the pulse of Harbin as if it were a part of her own heart. She had recently started taking night classes to improve her calligraphy, believing that a refined hand was the first step toward the life she envisioned for herself. She was a woman in motion, her small, purposeful steps leaving light prints in the fresh snow as she moved between the mill and her tiny, shared dormitory. Another woman, Fen, lived only a few blocks away and worked as a bookkeeper for a local coal company, a job that required a clinical mind and a steady hand. She was 24 years old and lived alone in a room filled with books on history and poetry, finding her peace in the silent study of the past. Fen was a woman of few words who preferred the company of her thoughts to the noise of the city, but she was always the first to offer help to a neighbor in need. She had a habit of standing on the riverbank at sunset, watching the ice floes move slowly toward the sea. Fen had a younger brother who was studying engineering in Beijing, and she viewed her work as a way to ensure he had every opportunity that she had been denied. She was a pillar of quiet strength for her family, a woman who managed the household accounts with the same precision she applied to the company ledgers. She didn't seek excitement, finding enough beauty in the changing of the seasons and the steady, reliable rhythm of her daily chores. Her life was a masterpiece of order and discipline, a testament to the power of a quiet mind in a loud and demanding world. These women, along with 4 others who shared similar dreams of a better life, moved through the winter of 1995 with no reason to believe their stories were nearing an abrupt and silent end. They were individual threads in the vast, colorful fabric of Harbin, each one contributing their own unique texture and strength to the city. They walked the same streets, breathed the same freezing air, and looked up at the same towering ice sculptures that dominated the winter skyline. They were a part of the city's pulse, a living, breathing presence that would soon be replaced by a chilling and inexplicable absence. By late December, the construction of the ice and snow world was in its final, frantic stage, with thousands of workers carving massive blocks of ice from the Songhua River. The air was filled with the roar of saws and the shouting of foremen as the translucent blue bricks were stacked into palaces, towers, and bridges that glowed like jewels at night. Among the army of workers was a skilled ice mason who worked exclusively on the foundations of the central palace tower. He was a man who moved with a terrifying autonomy, often staying late into the night when the other crews had returned to their warm barracks. In her thought, she thought the festival would be her escape. May had walked toward the lights on a night when the wind was so cold it seemed to freeze the very stars in the sky. She hadn't noticed the man in the heavy work coat following her, his footsteps silenced by the soft powder of the snow and the distant music of the fairground. She had only seen the towering palace of ice and the promise of a beauty that would last forever in the heart of the northern winter. The first off-key detail appeared during the peak of the festival in February, when a tourist from the south complained to a guard about a strange, dark shadow deep inside a wall. The guard looked at the block of ice, but the colored lights and the thickness of the frost made it impossible to see anything clearly. He dismissed it as a river weed or a clump of mud that had been frozen into the block during the harvest on the Songhua. The festival continued, with hundreds of thousands of people walking past the foundations of the great tower, their laughter vibrating through the very walls that held a secret. As the weeks passed, other workers noticed that the central palace felt unusually cold, even for a structure made of ice, and the air around the base had a faint, metallic scent. These observations were buried under the demands of the tourist season and the pressure from the provincial government to maintain the festival's perfect, magical image. The ice mason continued his work, his hands steady as he laid the final bricks and polished the surfaces until they shone like mirrors. He was a ghost in the machine of the festival, a man who understood the river's secrets better than anyone else. Wang reached the base of the tower and raised his pick. The sunlight glinting off the polished steel of the tool, he struck the ice with a heavy, practiced blow, expecting the translucent block to shatter into 100 sparkling fragments as it usually did. Instead, the pick bit into something soft and yielding, and a dull, hollow sound echoed through the melting structure. Wang paused, his brow furrowing as he looked closer at the point of impact, where a dark, organic shape was beginning to emerge from the receding blue ice. He struck again, more carefully this time, peeling away a thick layer of frost to reveal a flash of red fabric that looked unnervingly familiar. Wang felt a sudden, sharp prick of dread as he realized the fabric was a wool coat, its color still vibrant and deep, despite the months it had spent encased in the ice. He dropped his pick and began to scrape at the surface with his gloved hands, his breath coming in ragged, white gasps as the shape beneath the ice began to resolve into a human form. POV entry. You are standing in the shadow of a palace that is beginning to weep, and you realize the dark shape inches from your eyes is not a flaw in the ice. The cold air is suddenly filled with the sound of dripping water, a relentless, rhythmic ticking that feels like a countdown to a truth you are not prepared to face. You look into the translucent depths and see the pale, unblinking face of a woman, her features preserved with a terrifying clarity by the river water that has held her since the winter began. Observation. A city built of water is destined to reveal everything it hides once the sun returns. Wang backed away from the wall, his chest heaving as the face of May emerged from the melting tower, her eyes wide as if she were still surprised by the cold. He looked down the length of the wall and saw other shadows, 5 more dark shapes embedded at regular intervals along the foundation of the palace. The massive structure wasn't just a work of art, it was a vertical graveyard, a monument built out of the bodies of the missing. The police arrival was swift and shrouded in a level of secrecy that only the provincial government could coordinate on such short notice. They cordoned off the entire palace district, moving the other workers away and bringing in heavy tarpaulins to hide the site from the curious eyes of the city. The investigators worked in the cold shadows of the melting ice, their movements clinical and hurried as they began the grim task of extracting the victims. Each block had to be carefully melted or carved away to avoid damaging the evidence that had been frozen in time. Forensic teams discovered that all 6 women had been killed elsewhere before being placed into specialized molds and submerged in river water to create the building blocks. The victims were found in a seated or standing position within the ice, their bodies perfectly preserved by the sub-zero temperatures of the northern winter. Even more disturbing was the discovery that each woman's hands had been professionally removed at the wrist before they were frozen. This was a calculated act of cruelty designed to make identification through fingerprints impossible once the bodies were eventually found. The investigation traced the source of the ice to a specific, restricted section of the Songhua River that was off-limits to the public and the regular harvest crews. This area was controlled by a local government entity that managed the water flow for the city's industrial district, a place where few people ever ventured after dark. The killer had access to heavy machinery, large-scale freezing molds, and the specialized transport needed to move half-ton blocks of ice into the heart of the festival without being questioned. Police also found evidence of slow freezing, a process where the water is cooled gradually to prevent air bubbles and ensuring the ice remains perfectly clear. This suggested that the killer possessed a sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics and had a permanent facility where the victims could be cured over several weeks. It wasn't a crime of passion, but a high-level industrial project that required a terrifying degree of patience and technical skill. The killer had used the construction of the festival as a way to store his collection in the most public place imaginable. The twist came when the Public Security Bureau realized that the ice mason who had worked on the foundations had used a set of forged credentials from a defunct construction company. He had moved through the high-security environment of the festival for months, his presence authorized by paperwork that no one had bothered to verify. He was a phantom who had built his own gallery out of the lives of 6 women, using the provincial government's own resources to complete his horrific masterpiece. The Mason had disappeared the moment the festival ended, leaving no trail for the investigators to follow. The scale of the concealment was absolute, as the provincial authorities immediately classified the discovery as a state secret to protect the city's tourism revenue. The workers who found the bodies were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, and the official police reports were altered to reflect a natural disaster involving a structural collapse. The 6 women were quietly cremated in a government facility. Their remains never returned to the families, who were still waiting for letters that would never arrive. May's red coat and the other personal items were destroyed in an industrial furnace, erasing the final physical traces of their existence. The killer demonstrated a psychological profile of a man who viewed human beings as structural components rather than living entities. He had positioned the women as if they were the literal pillars of the palace, a symbolic gesture that suggested he saw himself as an architect of a more permanent and darker reality. The removal of the hands was not just a practical measure for concealment, but a ritualistic act of stripping the victims of their ability to touch or reach out to the world they were being removed from. The investigation eventually stalled as the higher levels of the government refused to allow the police to look into the industrial facilities along the Songhua River. The ice mason was never seen again in Harbin, and no one matching his description was ever arrested in the neighboring provinces. He had successfully used the order and the bureaucracy of the state to hide a series of crimes that defied the very laws the state was built to uphold. The case became a hole in the history of the city, a story that officially never happened in the spring of 1996. The legal outcome was a total and complete silence, with no charges ever being filed and no public acknowledgement of the victims' deaths. The families of the 6 women were told that their daughters had likely defected to the south or moved to Russia for work, a common occurrence in the economic chaos of the mid-90s. They were left to wait in their small villages, looking at the road and wondering why the letters had stopped coming. The truth was buried under layers of official denial and the cold, hard memory of the northern ice. Through 2026, no official records of the Harbin ice graves exist in the public archives of the Heilongjiang province. The case remains a whispered legend among the older generation of police officers, a warning about the things that can be hidden in plain sight when everyone is looking at the lights. Advanced forensic technology has never been applied to the case because the physical evidence was destroyed within 48 hours of its discovery. The 6 women remain unidentified and unmourned by the state that used their final resting place as a tourist attraction. The site where the palace once stood is now a modern park, with green grass and flower beds that show no sign of the frigid history that lies beneath the soil. Every winter, the city still builds its massive frozen palaces, and thousands of tourists still marvel at the blue light reflecting off the towers. But for those who remember the spring of 1996, the drip of meltwater will always sound like a voice trying to tell a story that the world has chosen to forget. The cold is a perfect vault, but even the strongest ice eventually has to give up what it holds. The frigid, blue silence of a northern Chinese riverbank is a world away from the shimmering heat waves of a desert dune in Inner Mongolia. It is a transition from the sound of dripping water to the grit of sand in your teeth as 5 men stand perfectly still in the sun, their eyes wide and dry, refusing to fall over. In the high summer of 1996, the Gobi Desert near Erenhot was a furnace of shifting orange sand and white-hot light. A geological survey team moved slowly across the dunes, their boots sinking deep into the fine dust as they searched for mineral deposits. The air was so dry it felt like a physical weight pressing against their chests, making every breath a sharp and difficult chore. They paused at the top of a massive ridge, shielding their eyes against the glare that bounced off the salt flats in the distance. A man named Da Wei was one of the many laborers who moved through the industrial underbelly of northern China during that decade. He was 42 years old and possessed the kind of quiet, weathered face that comes from a lifetime of working in brick kilns and coal mines. Dawe was technically a blacklist individual, a man whose residency papers had lapsed, forcing him to live in the shadows of the state system. He worked 12-hour shifts for half the legal pay, saving every single yuan to send back to his wife and young son in the rural West. Every evening, Dawe would sit on his narrow bunk in a shared dormitory, looking at a small, crumpled photograph of his son. The boy was holding a toy airplane made of balsa wood, his eyes bright with a pride that Dawe carried in his heart like a burning coal. He was saving for a specific blue bicycle he had seen in a shop window, a gift he intended to bring home for the boy's 10th birthday. His life was a series of small, calculated sacrifices made in the hope of a future where his family wouldn't have to live in fear of the local authorities. He was a man of few words who found his peace in the rhythmic work of the kiln, his hands moving with a steady precision as he stacked the heavy clay bricks. Dawe enjoyed the heat of the fire because it reminded him of the hearth in his childhood home, a place of warmth and safety that felt a world away. He didn't complain about the long hours or the meager food, believing that his endurance was the only currency he had to buy his family's freedom. He was a pillar of quiet strength for the other migrant workers, often sharing his small rations with those who were younger or weaker. In his spare time, Dawe would walk to the edge of the industrial zone and look out toward the vast, open plains of Inner Mongolia. He felt a deep connection to the land. Understanding the subtle shifts in the wind and the way the clouds moved across the horizon, he imagined his ancestors moving across those same plains, free from the constraints of the factories and the watchful eyes of the Public Security Bureau. This internal landscape was his only true sanctuary, a place where he could be more than just a number in a government ledger or a cog in a massive industrial machine. He had a habit of carving small animals out of peach pits using a sharpened piece of scrap metal he had found on the factory floor. He would give these carvings to the children of the other workers, watching their faces light up with a joy that he couldn't afford for himself. Dawe believed that every object should have a purpose, and his purpose was to build a world where his son would never have to work in a kiln. He was a man of profound integrity who lived by a code of honor that remained untouched by the corruption and greed of the world around him. His relationship with the other workers was built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared understanding of the risks they faced every day. They were all undesirables in the eyes of the state, people who could be moved or erased without anyone outside the dormitory ever noticing their absence. Dawe was the one they turned to when they needed a letter written or a dispute settled, his calm and steady voice acting as a bridge between their desperate lives. He was a man who understood that in a system designed to ignore you, the only thing that matters is how you treat the people standing beside you. He spent his final Sunday afternoon at a small, outdoor market, looking at the blue bicycle one last time to ensure he had saved enough money. He touched the chrome handlebars, feeling the cool metal against his calloused skin and imagining his son's hands gripping them for the first time. The sun was warm on his back, and for a brief moment, the weight of his responsibilities felt lighter than they ever had before. Dawe walked back to the dormitory with a sense of accomplishment, his mind filled with the image of his son pedaling down the dusty road toward a better life. He had a quiet passion for the ancient stories of the Silk Road, often telling the younger workers about the caravans that used to cross the Gobi centuries ago. He spoke of the grit of the sand and the resilience of the men who navigated the dunes without maps or modern technology. To Dawe, these stories were a reminder that the desert was not an enemy, but a testing ground for the human spirit. He viewed his own struggle through this same lens, seeing every difficult day as another mile in a journey that had to be completed for the sake of those he loved. Dawe was currently working on a carving of a camel for his son, meticulously shaping the hump and the long, graceful neck of the desert animal. He found a strange comfort in the repetitive scraping of the metal against the pit, a sound that helped him tune out the noise of the dormitory and the city. He was almost finished with the piece, wanting it to be perfect so his son would have a physical piece of the desert to keep with him. It was a small, tangible expression of a love that was too big for words and too deep for the factory walls to contain. On a humid evening in late July, a heavy military-style truck pulled into the courtyard of the factory complex, its engine idling with a deep and authoritative rumble. Two men in dark, unmarked uniforms entered the dormitory and called out 5 names from a typed list, including Dawei's. They told the men they were being relocated to a specialized construction project in the north that offered 3 times their current pay and a path to permanent residency. Dawei felt a surge of hope as he packed his meager belongings, thinking that his blue bicycle was finally within his reach. He placed the finished Peach Pit camel in his pocket and stepped into the back of the truck, joining the 4 other men who looked just as hopeful and nervous as he did. The canvas cover was dropped, plunging them into a thick and dusty darkness as the vehicle pulled away from the factory and headed toward the open desert. Dawei sat in the corner, his hand resting on the small carving, and closed his eyes to the rhythmic bumping of the wheels. He believed he was moving toward his future, unaware that he had been selected for an experiment that required his absolute and total silence. Inner thought Dawei wondered if the seat of the blue bicycle would be too high for his son, but he decided he would simply adjust the metal until it was perfect. He could see the boy's smile so clearly in his mind that it felt more real than the dark interior of the truck or the hot wind that whistled through the gaps in the canvas. He was a man who had spent his whole life waiting, and he believed that the wait was finally over. A final flash of optimism before the truck came to a sudden and final stop. The geological survey team spotted a group of figures on a distant dune, their shapes shimmering in the heat waves that rose from the salt-crusted earth. From a distance, they looked like travelers who had lost their way, or perhaps a group of border guards taking a rest in the sparse shade. The lead geologist raised his binoculars, his brow furrowing as he noticed that the men were standing perfectly upright and were dressed in matching, charcoal-colored mouse suits. They didn't seem to be moving, even as the wind whipped the fine sand around their feet in swirling, orange clouds. The team began to hike toward the dune, their pace quickening as they shouted to the men and offered them water from their heavy plastic canteens. As they got closer, the silence of the scene became heavy and oppressive, a physical presence that seemed to swallow the sound of their own footsteps. The figures remained frozen in a walking pose, their arms swinging mid-stride and their heads tilted toward the Mongolian border. The geologists stopped 10 feet away, their breath catching in their throats as they realized that the men were not resting, and they were no longer alive. POV entry. You are standing on a dune where the heat is so intense that the air seems to vibrate with a low, humming sound, and the grit of the sand is thick in your teeth. You look at the 5 men standing before you, their eyes wide and unblinking, their skin a pale and unnaturally smooth shade of gray that looks like polished stone. You realize that they aren't falling over because something inside them is holding them up, a secret structure that defies the weight of death and the shifting of the desert sand. Observation. A suit designed for the masses is the perfect uniform for a man who has been turned into a statue. The victims had been eviscerated and their skin treated with industrial salts to prevent rot in the dry heat of the Gobi. The Mao suits were brand new, their fabric stiff and clean, as if the men had been dressed specifically for this final, horrific display. The geological team backed away in terror, the sight of the unmoving men more shocking than any scene of violence they could have ever imagined in the desert. The Public Security Bureau arrived in the same type of heavy military trucks that had carried Dawei away from the factory months earlier. They immediately cordoned off the entire dune, their movements clinical and hurried as they began to document the site with high-resolution cameras and technical drawings. The investigators were led by a man with a cold, professional posture who seemed more interested in the preservation techniques than the identity of the victims. They moved with a terrifying autonomy, treating the scene as a classified industrial site rather than a place of mass murder. The autopsies revealed that the victims had been cured over several months in an indoor facility using a combination of salt immersion and chemical drying agents. This process had stripped the moisture from their tissues, turning their muscles and skin into a leather-like substance that was resistant to decay and insects. Most chillingly, heavy iron rods had been hammered into their legs and along their spines while the bodies were still being treated. These internal frameworks allowed the statues to remain standing in a lifelike pose, even as the desert winds shifted the ground beneath them. The precision of the curing process suggested a killer with access to a high-level laboratory and a background in industrial body preservation or taxidermy. The men had been selected for their health and their lack of social status, making them the perfect subjects for a macabre experiment in endurance after death. The killer had spent an incredible amount of time and resources to build these figures, suggesting a motive that was more artistic and ritualistic than practical. The statues were positioned as if they were a caravan moving through the Gobi, a permanent monument to a history that the state wanted to forget. Investigation into the truck tracks led the authorities toward a remote military testing ground that had been abandoned since the 1980s. The tracks were deep and heavy, suggesting a vehicle that was regularly maintained and operated by a driver who knew the desert trails with a professional's intimacy. However, the trail was lost in the shifting sands of the Erenhut district before it reached any permanent structure or road. The killer had operated with a level of logistical support that suggested he was either a high-ranking official or someone who worked for one of the country's many shadow organizations. Leaked reports from the 1996 investigation suggested that the victims might have been used in a macabre experiment by a local cult that worshipped the eternal spirit of the desert. These rumors spoke of a high-ranking official with a god complex who wanted to create a literal army of ghosts that would watch over the borders for all of eternity. The Mao suits were seen as a final insult, a way of binding the victims to the state even as they were being transformed into something entirely alien and horrifying. The truth was buried under layers of official secrecy and the vast, unblinking silence of the Gobi. The Public Security Bureau eventually classified the site and the findings as a state secret, moving the statues to a secure facility in an unmarked truck under the cover of darkness. The Geological Survey team was forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, and their initial reports were seized and destroyed by the regional authorities. The 5 men were never identified, and their fingerprints were found to have been chemically erased during the salt curing process. Dawei's dream of the blue bicycle and the peach pit camel vanished along with his name, leaving nothing behind but the grit of the desert and the memory of a mirage. The motive for the display remained a subject of intense and fearful debate among the investigators who had seen the site before the cover-up began. Some believed it was a warning aimed at the migrant workers who tried to cross the border, while others saw it as the work of a serial killer who viewed human bodies as a medium for his own twisted art. The Gobi Ghost Walkers became a whispered legend in Inner Mongolia, a story told to frighten travelers away from the abandoned dunes where the sand moves like water. The killer was never caught, and the facility where the men were cured was never located. The legal outcome was a cold and clinical erasure of the crime, with the local authorities officially classifying the discovery as a natural disaster involving heat stroke and dehydration. They claimed that the men were simply travelers who had been overwhelmed by the Gobi, and that the iron rods were a fabrication created by unreliable witnesses. The bodies were cremated in a government furnace, and the files were sealed under the National Security Act of 1996. There was no justice for Dawei or the 4 others, only the cold, hard certainty that the state would not allow its secrets to be exposed to the sun. Dawei's wife waited for him at the bus station for 3 days, her son clutching the small balsa wood airplane as the buses came and went without his father. She eventually returned to her village, telling her family that Dawei must have found a better life in the city and had chosen to start over without them. She never knew about the blue bicycle or the peach pit camel that had been found in the pocket of a standing corpse in the middle of the desert. Her life became a long, quiet wait for a man who had been turned into stone and then into ash by a system that didn't know his name. The Peach Pit camel was found by a young PSB officer during the initial documentation of the bodies, but he didn't report it to his superiors. He kept the small, intricately carved object in his pocket for years, a reminder of the human hand that had once held it in a factory dormitory. He often looked at the tiny humps and the graceful neck, wondering about the man who had spent his final hours of freedom creating something so beautiful and so small. The carving was the only physical link to the life Dawei had lived before he became a structural component in a desert nightmare. I believe the desert is a place where time doesn't work the same way it does in the city, where the past can be preserved by the very elements that are supposed to destroy it. The salt and the heat had turned Dawei into a statue, but the state had turned him into a ghost long before he ever reached that dune. His life was a series of silences that were finally made permanent by the iron rods in his spine and the suit on his back. The horror of the Gobi is not that the desert kills you, but that it can keep you exactly as you were when you died. Through 2026, the case remains officially closed as a weather-related tragedy, and no public inquiry has ever been allowed into the Ehrenhot statues. Advanced investigative technology has never been applied to the site, as the physical evidence was destroyed within 72 hours of the geological team's discovery. The 5 men are still listed as missing in the rural records, their names fading from the ledgers as the years pass and the memories of their families begin to blur. The Gobi continues to shift its sands, covering and uncovering the secrets that lie beneath the orange dunes. The site where the men were found is now part of a restricted industrial zone, with heavy fences and guard towers that keep the public away from the shifting dunes. The wind still blows across the flats, carrying the scent of salt and the sound of the sand moving against the stone. Every summer, the heat still turns the air into a shimmering mirage, and the travelers still report seeing figures standing on the distant ridges. But for those who know the history of 1996, the figures are a reminder of a caravan that was frozen in time and never reached its destination. The statues of the Gobi are a testament to the terrifying patience of a killer who understood that in the desert, you don't need a grave to hide a body. You only need a suit, a road, and a handful of salt to make someone stay exactly where you put them. The absolute silence of the dune is the final sound of a life that was lived in the shadows and ended in a display of macabre perfection. Dawei and his 4 companions remain a part of the desert's geography, a sequence of ghosts that continue to walk toward a border they will never cross. The desolate, man-made horror of a desert dune in Inner Mongolia is a sharp contrast to the ancient, natural tragedy of a salt flat in the Danakil Depression. It is a transition from the sound of a military truck to the shimmering heat waves where nature itself has frozen a caravan in place, their eyes wide and their hands still clutching the ropes of the dead. In the pre-dawn dark of a Tuesday in October, 1995, a man named Abdur moved through the low-slung stone huts of his village on the edge of the Danakil Depression. He was 46 years old, with skin as dark and weathered as the volcanic basalt that defined the northern reaches of Ethiopia. Abdur adjusted the heavy cotton wrap around his shoulders, feeling the familiar, dry heat of the Rift Valley already beginning to rise from the earth. He whistled low to his lead camel, a massive, bad-tempered animal he had named Malik, and began the rhythmic work of checking the harness for the long journey ahead. Abdur had been a salt miner for 30 years, following a path through the Danakil that his father and grandfather had walked before the borders of the modern world were ever drawn. He lived in a small settlement where the survival of every family depended entirely on the ancient, grueling trade of the salt flats. To Abdur, the desert was not a wasteland, but a storehouse of wealth that required a specific kind of patience and a total, unwavering respect for the elements. He spent his few days of rest sitting in the shade of a thorn tree, telling his children stories of the caravans that had crossed these sands when the world was young. He was a man of profound and quiet strength, possessed of a physical endurance that seemed to defy the limits of the human body. Abdur could walk for 20 miles across white-hot salt crusts with only a single skin of water, his pace never wavering, and his eyes always fixed on the shimmering horizon. He viewed his work as a sacred duty to his ancestors, a way of maintaining the balance between the needs of his people and the demands of the harsh, unyielding land. He was known throughout the Afar region as a leader of caravans, a man whose internal compass was so precise he could find a single hidden well in a landscape of 1,000 identical dunes. His eldest daughter, Fatuma, was set to be married in the coming month, an event that required Abdur to bring back a particularly large haul of salt to cover the wedding costs. He had spent his evenings discussing the arrangements with the village elders, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded respect, even in the busiest of meetings. Abdur wanted to provide his daughter with a dowry that would ensure her status in her new home, a final act of protection before she began a life of her own. He looked at her as she prepared the morning meal, seeing the same resilience in her eyes that had allowed their people to survive in the hottest place on earth for centuries. The preparation for a salt caravan was a ritual of absolute precision, where a single forgotten knot or a leaking water skin could mean the difference between life and death. Abdur personally inspected each of the 20 camels in the group, checking their feet for sores and their packs for any sign of imbalance. He moved among the other 13 miners, younger men who looked to him for guidance and reassurance in the face of the journey's legendary difficulty. There was a quiet, focused energy in the camp, the kind that belongs to men who understand that they are entering a world where the margin for error is non-existent. Abdur's home was a place of sparse, functional beauty, filled with the smell of roasted coffee and the soft sound of his wife's loom as she worked in the shadows. He didn't own many things, but the items he possessed were of the highest quality: a hand-forged knife, a sturdy leather satchel, and a silver ring that had been in his family for 4 generations. He believed that a man should carry only what he needs to survive, and that the true measure of a life was the strength of one's reputation. As the sun began to break over the horizon, he took a final sip of coffee, nodded to his family, and led the caravan out into the shimmering white void of the Danakil. The first few days of the trek were a testament to the brutal, monotonous beauty of the salt flats, where the temperature frequently climbed to 120 degrees before noon. Abdur led the line of 14 men and 20 camels across the cracked Indreg, white expanse, their silhouettes shimmering like ghosts in the intense heat waves. They moved in a rhythmic, trance-like state, the only sound being the rhythmic crunch of the salt crust beneath the camel's feet and the occasional, sharp cry of a guide. Abdur kept a constant eye on the horizon, watching for the dust devils that signaled a change in the wind or the arrival of a sudden, blending sandstorm. He had a deep, intuitive understanding of the camels, knowing which ones were struggling with the heat and which ones were strong enough to carry the extra weight. Malik, the lead camel, moved with a steady, arrogant gait, his head held high as if he were the true master of the desert. Abdur often reached out to touch the animal's neck, a silent gesture of companionship that only another salt miner could truly understand. The bond between the men and their animals was the foundation of the caravan, a collective strength that allowed them to push through the most hostile environments known to man. They spent their nights huddled together in the lee of the camels, watching the stars move across a sky so clear it felt like you could reach out and touch the edge of the universe. Abdur would tell the younger men about the land of the breath of God, a specific stretch of the salt flat that the Afar tribes avoided because the air was said to be cursed. He spoke of caravans that had vanished into the haze, their tracks ending in the middle of a perfect white circle without any sign of a struggle or a storm. To Abdur, these were not just myths, but a part of the landscape's long and dangerous memory. He carried a small pouch of dried dates and a handful of parched grain, the simple diet that had sustained salt miners for 1,000 years. He didn't eat much, his body having adapted to the extreme conditions until he seemed to function on the very air and light of the desert itself. Abdur was a man of intense, Inward focus, his mind a quiet sanctuary where he could retreat from the relentless glare of the sun. He felt a profound sense of peace in the middle of the wasteland, a feeling of being exactly where he was meant to be in the grand, unfolding history of his people. The route they followed took them toward the salt market at Mekelle, a journey that usually took 2 weeks of steady, unwavering effort. Abdur had mapped out the journey to ensure they reached the midway well, just as their initial water supplies were beginning to run low. He was a master of timing, calculating the movement of the group with the same clinical precision a watchmaker applies to a set of gears. As they approached the area known as the Danakil Depression, the terrain shifted from white salt to black, jagged volcanic rock that shimmered with a dull, oily luster in the midday sun. Inner thought, Abdur looked at the horizon and thought of the silk fabric he would buy for Fatuma's wedding dress, imagining the way the red dye would look against her dark skin. He could almost hear the sound of the flutes and the laughter of the village. A warm, bright memory that kept his feet moving, even when the heat felt like a physical blow to his head. He was a man who lived for the return, for the moment when the caravan emerged from the dust and the children ran out to greet them. On the 10th day, the caravan entered a vast, shallow basin where the earth was a pale, sickly yellow, and the air felt unusually thick and heavy. The wind, which usually provided a small measure of relief, had died down completely, leaving the group in a state of absolute, ringing silence. Abdur noticed that the camels were unusually quiet, their ears flickering as if they were listening to a sound that was just beyond the reach of human hearing. He tightened his grip on Malik's lead rope, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the shimmering heat waves that usually define the midday desert. Observation: a desert that stops breathing is a desert that is preparing to take something back. Abdur felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his ears, a sensation of being submerged in deep water, even though he was standing in the middle of a parched and ancient seabed. He looked back at the 13 men following him, their faces masks of sweat and dust, their eyes fixed on the heels of the person in front of them. The air was becoming difficult to draw into his lungs, feeling thin and metallic, as if the very life was being squeezed out of the atmosphere by an invisible hand. When the caravan failed to arrive at the market town of Mekelle on the scheduled date, the local merchants began to worry, knowing that Abdur was never late. A reconnaissance plane from the Ethiopian Air Force was dispatched to fly over the traditional salt routes, the pilot's eyes searching the vast, white expanse for the dark line of the camels. For hours, the plane circled the Danakil, the pilot seeing nothing but the endless, shimmering flats and the occasional, lonely outcrop of black rock. Then, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, he spotted a group of dark shapes standing perfectly still in the center of a yellow salt basin. The pilot descended until he was only 50 meters above the ground, his eyes widening as the image in the cockpit became clear. He saw 14 men and 20 camels, positioned in a perfect, straight line as if they were still moving toward their destination. But they weren't moving. The men were standing upright, their hands clutching the lead ropes of the camels, and the animals were frozen in mid-stride, their heads held high against the desert sky. The pilot radioed back to the base, his voice shaking as he described the standing ghosts of the Danakil, a caravan that looked alive from the air but possessed the terrifying stillness of a statue. A ground search team of Afar tribesmen and regional authorities reached the site 2 days later, their boots crunching on the brittle, yellow salt as they approached the figures. The air in the basin was still and unnaturally cold, a sharp contrast to the blistering heat of the surrounding desert. As they neared the caravan, the searchers stopped in their tracks, the sight before them defying every law of nature and death they had ever encountered. The men and the camels were dead, but they had not slumped to the ground or been scattered by the wind. They remained standing exactly where they had died. Companion voice: you can walk with the searchers into that silent line, where the only movement is the fluttering of a torn cotton wrap in a sudden, weak gust of wind. The smell is not one of decay. but of salt and old dust. A clinical and dry scent that seems to have preserved the moment of death with a terrifying and absolute fidelity. You realize that you are standing in a gallery of the dead, where the artist is the earth itself and the medium is a sudden, invisible change in the air. Abdur stood at the head of the line, his hand still firmly wrapped around the lead rope of Malik, his body leaning slightly forward as if he were still leading the way. His eyes were wide open, looking toward the distant mountains with an expression of profound, unblinking calm. There were no signs of a struggle, no bullet wounds, and no indication that the men had suffered from dehydration or heat stroke. In fact, when the searchers checked the water skins on the camels' backs, they found them to be nearly full, the cool liquid sloshing against the leather as the animals were moved. The forensic investigators who arrived later noted that the victims showed no signs of typical desert trauma, such as cracked lips or sunken eyes. It appeared that death had been so sudden and so total that the bodies hadn't even had time to collapse before the intense heat and the salt-laden air began to flash dry them. The moisture had been pulled from their tissues in a matter of hours, turning their muscles and skin into a leather-like substance that provided the structural integrity needed to keep them upright. They were mummies created by a natural process that functioned with the precision of a laboratory experiment. The ground around the caravan was completely undisturbed, with no tracks leading to or from the site except for the caravan's own path coming in from the south. The investigators found that the men's hands were so tightly gripped around the ropes that the fibers had become embedded in their dried skin. Malik, the lead camel, stood with his mouth slightly open, as if he had been about to let out a cry when the end came. It was a snapshot of a single second in time, a moment of transition that had been made permanent by the unique chemistry of the Danakil Basin. The initial theories in 1995 ranged from a localized lightning strike to a mass poisoning, but none of the evidence supported a human or violent cause. Forensic experts eventually turned their attention to the geological nature of the Rift Valley, a place where the Earth's crust is thin and the volcanic activity is constant. They speculated that a sudden CO2 burp had occurred, a massive release of carbon dioxide from a subterranean fissure in the floor of the salt flat. This invisible, odorless gas would have displaced the oxygen in the basin in a matter of seconds, suffocating the entire caravan before a single man could even realize he was in danger. You are standing in a world where the air has suddenly turned into a solid, unbreathable weight that fills your lungs but offers no life. The silence of the desert is no longer a comfort, but a suffocating curtain that falls over your eyes and your mind before you can even drop the rope in your hand. Your heart stops mid-beat, and the last thing you see is the shimmering horizon that you have spent your entire life trying to reach. You become a part of the landscape, a vertical monument to the fact that in the Danakil, the very breath of God can be a lethal and invisible force. The scientific explanation, while logical, didn't account for the fact that nature rarely kills with such aesthetic precision. A gas release usually leaves bodies in a state of disarray, as victims struggle for air or attempt to flee the invisible cloud. But the silent caravan had died with a dignity and a sense of order that suggested a level of intent that the investigators couldn't explain. The Afar tribesmen refused to go near the site, believing that the men had been taken by the desert because they had seen something they were not meant to see. Abdur's family was never able to recover his body, as the regional authorities decided that the site was too dangerous and unstable for a recovery operation. The government officially recorded the event as a weather-related tragedy, a label that felt hollow and inadequate to those who had seen the standing dead from the air. The wedding of Fatuma was never held, replaced by a season of mourning that stretched across the entire region as the news of the vanishing spread. The salt trade continued, but the miners avoided the Yellow Basin, taking the long way around to ensure they stayed far from the breath of God. Earned reflection, I believe that the desert doesn't just take lives, it sometimes chooses to display them as a warning to those who think they have mastered the land. Abdur was a man who knew the Danakil better than anyone, yet he was the one who was chosen to stand at the head of a line of ghosts for all eternity. It is a reminder that in the most hostile places on our planet, we are only ever guests, and our tenure can be revoked by a single, silent shift in the earth beneath our feet. The case remains a subject of intense scientific debate, with researchers from around the world traveling to the Danakil to study the outgassing events of the Rift Valley. They use sensors and satellites to track the movement of the Earth, hoping to predict the next burp before it can claim another caravan. But the desert is vast and unpredictable, and the sensors often fail in the extreme heat and salt-laden air. The mystery of the 1995 vanishing remains a cold case of natural horror, a story of a routine journey that ended in a permanent and upright silence. Through 2026, the site of the silent caravan is officially listed as a geological hazard zone, and no tourists or researchers are permitted to enter the Yellow Basin. The bodies have likely been broken down by the elements or buried by the shifting salt over the last 30 years. But the legend of the standing dead remains a vital part of the Afar tradition. New miners are told the story of Abdur and his 20 camels, a warning to always listen for the sound of the air before it stops moving. The desert has a way of erasing its tracks, but it never forgets the people who once walked there. Abdur's silver ring was never found, likely still resting on the finger of a hand that continues to clutch a ghost rope in the middle of a salt flat. The memory of the man survives in the stories told around the village hearths, a tale of a father who went to buy a wedding dress and became a part of the mountains he loved. The Danakil remains a place of absolute and dangerous beauty, where the sun and the salt work together to create a history that is written in stone and bone. The silence of the basin is a permanent weight that remains long after the wind has returned to the rest of the valley. The standing, natural tragedy of a salt caravan in the Ethiopian desert is the final echo of a night filled with lives that were paused and then preserved in the most terrifying of ways. It is the closing chapter in a gallery of the strange and the dark, where the victims remain frozen in their final poses, waiting for a dawn that will never truly arrive. The rain continues to drum against your window, but out in the Danakil, the air is as dry and as still as the memory of a man who refused to fall over. The air in your room likely feels a little thicker now than it did an hour ago, as if the stories have taken up physical space in the corners. You might find yourself looking at the shadows near the ceiling or the way the light reflects off the dark glass of your window. It is a strange thing to realize how much we rely on the walls around us to keep the world at a comfortable distance. The stories of the standing dead in the desert or the woman under the glass floor are not just accounts of tragedy, but observations on the permanence of a single moment. We spend our lives in motion, planning for weddings that will never happen or buying bicycles that will never be ridden. We assume there will always be a tomorrow to finish the carving or to mail the letter home to our mothers. When you sit very still in the dark, you can almost hear the rhythmic ticking of the world as it moves forward without any concern for our individual plans. The Danakil salt flats do not care about the gold ring on a miner's finger, and the Songhua River does not care about the dreams of a girl in a red coat. Nature has a way of absorbing our histories and turning them into nothing more than a sequence of cold, silent facts. I find myself thinking about the tuxedo diver in Iceland and the way he chose to be found exactly as he wanted to be remembered. There is a specific kind of dignity in that final, controlled act, a way of saying that even in death, a man can still hold on to his secrets. He left no name and no trail, only a jet black suit and the quiet hum of the geothermal water pressing against his chest. Then there are the others, the ones like the council members in the elevator or the novice monk in the meditation hall, who were simply subtracted from the room. They didn't have the chance to pose or to prepare a final message for the people who would eventually find their empty clothes. They were here 1 second, breathing and thinking about their families, and then they were just an empty space that the air rushed in to fill. It is the mundane details that stay with me the longest, like the smell of lemon wax in a lobby or the rough texture of a woven mat beneath a pair of knees. These are the small, precise things that anchor us to reality before the unknown reaches out to change the rules of the game. We think we are safe because we have biometric locks and iron bars. But those things are only as strong as the world's willingness to follow the rules. Take a moment to listen to the sounds in your own house right now. The settling of the floorboards or the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. In the middle of the night, these ordinary noises can start to sound like footsteps or a door being slowly unbolted in a room you thought was empty. We live in a state of constant, quiet trust that the world around us will remain exactly as we left it when we turned off the light. The people in these stories were not looking for a mystery or a place in a cold case file. They were simply living their lives with a steady, quiet purpose. They were fathers helping their daughters study for exams and young women saving their money to send back to their villages in the south. They were the ordinary pillars of a world that we all inhabit. A world that can sometimes become a vertical graveyard without a single sound of warning. There is a weight to the silence that follows a story like the one from the Alpha Peninsula, where a room was painted red just to hide the spray of the end. It is a reminder that the most terrifying things are often hidden behind the most boring and unassuming walls in the middle of a marsh. We walk past these places every day, never knowing that a bunker or a crawl space might be sitting right beneath our very feet. I hope that as you sit there in the quiet, you feel a sense of connection to the people we talked about tonight, the ones who are now just names in a digital archive. They were just like us, with their own small habits and their own deep fears, trying to find a bit of warmth in a cold and often indifferent universe. Their stories are a way of making sure that their final poses are not the only thing the world remembers about them. If you have a cup of tea or a glass of water nearby, you might notice that it has gone cold while we were traveling through the deserts and the frozen palaces of the north. The physical world has a way of reasserting itself once the narrative ends, reminding us that we are still here, sitting in our chairs. The rain is still hitting the glass, and the locks on your front door are still holding back the vast, dark night outside. I want to thank you for spending this time with me in the dark, for being a part of this quiet community that gathers to listen to the things that happen in the shadows. It is a comfort to know that there are others out there who find a strange kind of peace in the exploration of the mysterious and the unexplained. Your presence makes the room feel a little less lonely, even when the stories are at their most chilling and cold. If you found something in these accounts that made you think or that stayed with you after the audio ended, please consider leaving a comment to share your thoughts with the rest of us. It is through these small interactions that we build a history of our own, a record of how we process the darkness together. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you can join us the next time we turn down the lights. Check the latches on your windows one more time before you head to bed, not because there is something waiting outside, but because order is a gift we give to ourselves. There is a deep satisfaction in knowing that your space is secure and that the world is kept exactly where it belongs. The silence of a safe house is a very different thing from the silence of a desert basin where nature has stopped its breathing. Think about the man in the Gobi with the Peach Pit camel in his pocket and the promise he made to a son who is still waiting for his blue bicycle. We carry these small tokens of our love with us wherever we go, and they are often the only things that truly matter in the end. The state may try to erase a name or a history, but they can never truly destroy the intent behind a hand-carved gift for a child. The room is very still now, and the white noise has become a steady, comforting rhythm that suggests the night is finally settling into its true and deepest form. You are safe in your bed, and the stories are now just memories that will eventually fade into the background of your own life. The characters have returned to their archives and their cold case files, leaving you with the quiet and the dark of your own home. I will leave you now to the silence and the soft sound of the rain, which has a way of washing away the grit and the dust of the day. Sleep well, and try not to think too much about the spaces beneath the floors or the things that might be frozen inside the ice. The world is exactly as it should be, and the morning will arrive with its usual, reliable light to show us that the shadows were only shadows. The lesson, if there is one to be found in these 11 stories, is that we should cherish the mundane and the ordinary while we still have the chance to hold them. A black coffee in the morning, The sound of a daughter's laugh, and the feel of a sturdy leather briefcase are the things that define a life. They are the small, precise anchors that keep us from drifting away into the whiteout of the unknown or the red void of the marshes. Stay safe. Look after the people who matter most to you. And remember that even in the most hostile environments, the human spirit still tries to leave a mark. Whether it is a carved lotus or a swirl of blood on a canvas, we all want to be seen, even if it is only after the silence has already taken hold. I will be here the next time you need a story to fill the quiet hours of the night. The clock on the wall continues to mark the seconds. Its steady beat a reminder that time is the only thing we can never truly curate or control. We move through the hours like travelers in a caravan, hoping that the air stays clear and the path remains visible beneath our feet. The destination is less important than the way we treat the people who are walking beside us through the shifting sands of the world. The room feels settled now, the weight of the narrative slowly lifting as the white noise takes over and the rain begins to taper off into a soft, steady mist. You can close your eyes and let the darkness become a blanket, a space of rest and recovery before the sun returns to start the cycle all over again. There are no more statues to see and no more locked rooms to explore until the next time we meet here. I will stay here for just a moment longer, listening to the quiet with you, before I finally turn off the microphone and vanish into the night myself. It has been a long journey from the Blue Lagoon to the Danakil Salt Flats, and I am glad that we made the trip together. The world is a large and mysterious place, but it feels a little smaller and more manageable when we share its secrets in the dark. One last look at the door, one last check of the heater, and then it is time to let the silence have the final word for the night. The stories are done, the poses are set, and the history of the mid-90s has been laid out for you like a set of ancient maps. You have everything you need to navigate the remaining hours of the dark until the light finally breaks over the horizon. Good night, and take the quiet with you as you go, letting it be a source of strength rather than a source of fear in the hours to come. The world is waiting for you to wake up and start your own routine, to leave your own small marks on the day that is about to arrive. But for now, just sit in the silence and breathe in the cool, still air of your own sanctuary. The rain has stopped, and the only sound left is the faint, distant hum of the city as it prepares for the morning that is still several hours away. The room is perfectly still, and the darkness is absolute and kind, a space where the secrets of the past can finally rest in peace. There is nothing left to say, and nothing left to do but to let the silence settle over everything like a heavy, soft cloth. The final image I have for you is of a small, silver ring sitting in the dust of a desert basin, its surface worn smooth by the wind and the passage of time. It is a tiny, forgotten piece of a life that was lived with intensity and love, a physical echo of a man who refused to fall over. It is still there, and as long as someone remembers the story, the man who wore it is never truly gone. The room is now so quiet that you can hear your own heart beating, a steady and reliable rhythm that tells you that you are alive and you are safe. The stories have retreated into the shadows, leaving you with the peace and the stillness that you have earned by listening to the very end. The night is yours, and the silence is your companion as you drift toward the morning. Subscribe if you want to find your way back to this place, and leave a comment if you want to leave a trace of your own presence in the dark. It is a light invitation to join us again, a way of keeping the door unbolted for the next time the world starts to feel a little too predictable. Until then, stay safe and keep your eyes open for the small, off-key details of your own life. The air is cool, the house is still, and the late 20th century and the 1990s are now just a part of the long and silent history of the night. You are the only one left in the room, and the silence is exactly as it should be, a heavy and profound weight that marks the end of the episode. There is no more to tell, and the dark is now your own to do with as you wish. The silence is absolute,